The dead don't always stay buried, especially when they die with unfinished business. I'm Father Martinez, and after 37 years hearing confessions, I've learned that some sins follow you to the grave, and some graves refuse to let go. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what you're about to witness will follow you home. Now get ready. Let's start story 1. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father O'Brien discovered it on a Tuesday morning in October 1987, a confessional booth standing in the center of Riverside Cemetery in Charleston. Not beside the chapel, not near any building, just there, in the middle of the graveyard, perfectly preserved oak, gleaming with morning dew. "That's impossible," he whispered, circling the structure. The cemetery had been his responsibility for 12 years. Every headstone, every tree, every inch of consecrated ground was mapped in his memory. This confessional had never existed here. The brass nameplate read, Father Dominic Voss, 1823-1847. O'Brien's blood chilled. He knew that name from the parish records, a priest who had vanished during confession one winter night, leaving behind only blood on the booth's interior walls. The confessional stood 7 feet tall, its dark wood unmarked by weather or time. Intricate carvings of angels adorned the doors, but their faces were wrong, twisted in expressions of anguish rather than peace. The screen between the priest and penitent sides was intact, its metal lattice gleaming like fresh silver. O'Brien ran his fingers along the wood, expecting splinters or decay. Instead, the surface felt warm, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The scent of old incense and something else, something metallic and sweet, drifted from within. As he examined the impossible structure, the temperature around the confessional began to drop. 20 degrees. 30. His breath came out in visible puffs while the rest of the cemetery remained warm in the October sun. Frost formed on nearby headstones, spreading outward in perfect circles from the booth. Other groundskeepers arrived, drawn by O'Brien's shouting. They saw nothing. To them, the center of the cemetery was empty earth, unmarked by any structure. Only O'Brien could see the confessional, could feel its supernatural cold seeping into his bones. "Father, are you feeling all right?" asked Thomas, the head groundskeeper. "You're staring at nothing." O'Brien turned to point at the obvious structure, but doubt crept into his mind. The confessional was there. He could touch it, smell it, feel its presence pressing against his consciousness. But if others couldn't see it? As evening approached, shadows began to gather around the booth despite the clear sky. The temperature continued to plummet, and O'Brien noticed something else: the silence. No birds sang near the confessional, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to avoid the area, creating a pocket of absolute stillness. At exactly 6:47 p.m., a voice drifted from within the booth. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned, and I cannot leave until someone hears me." O'Brien's hands trembled as he approached. The booth's interior candle flickered to life on its own, casting dancing shadows through the carved screen. The flame burned with an unusual color, not warm yellow but cold blue, like gas fire. "How long has it been since your last confession?" O'Brien asked, his training overriding his fear. 140 years, came the reply from within. The voice was hollow, echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a well. "I have been waiting for another priest to finish what was left undone." Through the screen, O'Brien could make out a shadowy figure kneeling on the other side. The shape was human, but wrong, too thin, too still, like a scarecrow dressed in clerical robes. "I am Father Dominic Voss," the voice continued. "I died in this booth during the sacrament of confession, shot through the heart while absolving a sinner. My blood soaked into this wood, and I have been trapped here ever since." O'Brien pressed his eye to the screen, straining to see clearly. The figure inside wore rotting vestments, their fabric hanging in tatters. Where its face should have been, only shadow remained. But 2 points of cold light glowed where eyes might once have been. Every night I feel the bullet tear through my chest again, Father Voss continued. Every dawn I die once more. I cannot rest until someone completes what was left unfinished. Sir, the confessional door behind O'Brien creaked open, inviting him inside. The blue flame flickered, casting his shadow across the cemetery grounds. In that shadow, other shapes moved. The silhouettes of priests who had entered this booth before him, all trapped in the same supernatural prison. "What do you need?" O'Brien whispered, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "You must hear my final confession," Father Voss replied. "The one I never got to make before I died. But know this, once you hear it, you become bound to this place. Another will have to take your place before you can find peace." O'Brien's rational mind screamed warnings, but his priestly vows demanded compassion for the suffering soul. The Catholic Church taught that all souls deserved absolution, even those trapped between worlds. How could he turn away from someone in spiritual torment? "Tell me your sins, Father," O'Brien said, stepping into the priest's side of the confessional. The moment his feet crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with the finality of a tomb. The air inside was thick and suffocating, tasting of copper and decay. The blue flame provided the only light, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. "I killed him," Father Voss whispered through what remained of his lips. "The man who came to confess that night, I broke the seal of confession. I told his wife about his adultery, and she murdered him in his sleep. His blood is on my hands." O'Brien felt the booth grow smaller, the walls pressing inward like a coffin. The wood creaked and groaned, as if the entire structure was being compressed by invisible hands. His breathing became labored as the space continued to shrink. "God forgives all sins, Father," O'Brien managed to say, "even yours, through the power of Christ's sacrifice." "No!" Voss shrieked, his voice multiplying into a chorus of anguish. "Don't you understand? I died unabsolved. My sin holds me here, and now it holds you too." The confessional began to sink into the earth, descending slowly into a grave that opened beneath them. O'Brien clawed at the walls, his fingernails leaving bloody streaks in the wood. Through the gaps in the boards, he could see dirt pouring in like water, filling the space around them. "Every priest who enters this booth adds another layer to my prison," Voss laughed bitterly. "Father Mackenzie in 1963, Father Torres in 1981, Father Sullivan in 1994, and now you. We're all here, O'Brien, buried alive in our own guilt." O'Brien could hear them now, the voices of other priests trapped in the supernatural confessional. They whispered their own unabsolved sins, creating a cacophony of guilt and despair that threatened to drive him mad. Father Mackenzie had stolen from the church collection. Father Torres had broken his vow of celibacy. Father Sullivan had knowingly given last rites to a murderer without requiring true repentance. All had died with their sins unconfessed, and all had been drawn to this cursed booth. "Why?" O'Brien gasped as the dirt reached his waist. "Why trap us here?" "Because we failed," Voss replied. "We failed our vows, our God, our people. This is our purgatory, to confess our sins to each other for eternity, never finding absolution." The realization hit O'Brien like a physical blow. This wasn't just a haunted confessional. It was a supernatural prison, designed specifically for corrupt priests. Their own guilt had made them vulnerable to its pull, drawing them like moths to a flame. As the dirt reached his chest, O'Brien understood the terrible irony. They were trapped in an endless cycle of confession without absolution, the very sacrament they had perverted in life becoming their eternal torment in death. "There is a way out," Voss whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of falling earth. "But it requires a sacrifice. One of us must take on all the sins of the others. One must bear the weight of our collective guilt." O'Brien's vision began to blur as the dirt reached his neck. The other trapped priests began to chant in Latin, their voices rising in a desperate plea for salvation. The words were familiar, the prayer of absolution, but spoken in reverse, creating an invocation of damnation rather than redemption. In his final moments of consciousness, O'Brien made a choice that would damn his soul, but perhaps save the others. He began to speak the words that would transfer their sins to him, making himself the sole bearer of their collective guilt. "I accept your sins as my own," O'Brien whispered as the dirt filled his mouth. "Let your souls find peace through my damnation." The effect was immediate and terrible. Every sin committed by the trapped priests flowed into O'Brien's soul like molten metal. The weight of their collective guilt pressed down on him, crushing his spirit as surely as the earth crushed his body. Father Voss's betrayal of the confessional seal, Father Mackenzie's theft from widows and orphans, Father Torres's violation of his sacred vows, Father Sullivan's blessing of the unrepentant. All of it became O'Brien's burden to bear. But as the sins transferred, something unexpected happened. The other priests began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as their guilt left them. One by one, they smiled with genuine peace for the first time in decades, their souls finally free to move on to judgment. "Thank you," Father Voss whispered as his form dissolved into light. "Your sacrifice has freed us all." The confessional stopped sinking. The dirt that had been pouring in like water suddenly became solid again, trapping O'Brien in a pocket of air 6 feet underground. He was alone now, buried alive with the weight of 5 men's sins on his soul. But he was not dead. The supernatural nature of the confessional kept him in a state between life and death, conscious and suffering, but unable to die. He had become the new guardian of the cursed booth, destined to wait for the next corrupt priest to stumble into its trap. Days passed. Weeks. O'Brien lost track of time in the darkness. He could hear the world above, footsteps of visitors, the sound of other funeral services, the changing of seasons. But no one could hear him, trapped as he was in his underground prison. The confessional had reset itself, appearing in another cemetery, in another city. O'Brien could sense it through their supernatural connection, waiting patiently for its next victim. The cycle would continue as it had for nearly 2 centuries. Sometimes O'Brien tried to pray, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. How could he ask for forgiveness when he carried the unabsolved sins of so many? His sacrifice had been noble, but it had also damned him to an eternity of suffering. Other times, he found himself planning. If another priest entered the confessional, perhaps O'Brien could warn them. Perhaps he could break the cycle instead of perpetuating it. But he knew the supernatural compulsion would be too strong. The booth called to guilty priests like a siren song, and they would come willingly to their doom. One night, exactly a year after his burial, O'Brien heard scratching above him. Someone was digging. Hope flared in his chest. Perhaps someone had discovered his fate and come to rescue him. But as the dirt was cleared away, O'Brien saw the truth. Standing above his grave was another priest, Father Kowalski from St. Mary's in Detroit. The man's eyes were wild with guilt and desperation. "I heard you calling," Father Kowalski said. "I heard your voice in my dreams, telling me to come here, telling me you could take away my sins." O'Brien tried to warn him, tried to explain the trap, but no sound came from his throat. The supernatural curse prevented him from revealing the truth. Instead, he could only watch in horror as Father Kowalski climbed down into the grave with him. "I killed her," Father Kowalski confessed. "My housekeeper. She found out about the money I'd been stealing, and I pushed her down the stairs, made it look like an accident. I need absolution, Father. I need someone to hear my confession." As Father Kowalski spoke, O'Brien felt the familiar weight of new sin pressing down on him. The cycle was beginning again, but this time he was not just the victim, he was the instrument of damnation. The confessional materialized around them, its wooden walls sealing them into their supernatural prison. O'Brien had become Father Voss, doomed to hear confessions he could never absolve, trapped by his own desire to help others, even at the cost of his soul. Outside, the cemetery groundskeeper found the filled grave the next morning. There was no sign that anyone had been digging, no evidence of the supernatural drama that had played out beneath the earth. A new nameplate appeared on a headstone that hadn't been there the day before. Father Michael O'Brien, 1954-1988. The confessional had vanished again, carrying its victims to a new hunting ground. And somewhere in another city, another guilt-ridden priest was beginning to dream of a voice calling to him in the darkness, promising absolution, but delivering only damnation. Now get ready. Let's start story 2. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. Father Castellanos found them every morning. Rosaries wrapped around headstones like nooses, their beads stained crimson. Not paint, not rust. Blood that stayed wet no matter how many days passed, glistening in the Arizona sun like fresh wounds. Holy Cross Cemetery in Phoenix had been peaceful for decades until the rosaries started appearing. Always 13 beads missing from each strand. Always positioned around the graves of murderers and suicides, the souls buried without final rites, their bodies laid to rest in unconsecrated ground at the cemetery's far edge. "It's probably just vandalism," insisted Miguel, the groundskeeper, but his voice carried no conviction. He'd been working the cemetery for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. The rosaries weren't randomly placed. They were positioned with deliberate precision, each one telling a story of sin and damnation. Castellanos knelt beside the grave of Vincent Torino, a man who had murdered his wife and children before taking his own life in 1987. The rosary around his headstone was beautiful, hand-carved obsidian beads strung on silver wire, the kind that would have cost hundreds of dollars. But it was wrong. 13 beads were missing from the traditional 59, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a skull's grin. More disturbing was the blood. Castellanos touched one of the stained beads and immediately recoiled. The blood was warm, body temperature, as if it had just been spilled. He wiped his finger on his cassock and found his own fingerprint left a bloody smear on the black fabric. "Father," Miguel's voice was tight with fear, "you need to see this." The groundskeeper led him to the newest section of the cemetery, where fresh graves marked the recently departed. Maria Vasquez's headstone was wreathed with a rosary that Castellanos recognized immediately. It belonged to St. Anthony's Chapel downtown, one of 7 that had been reported stolen the previous week. "She's still warm," Miguel whispered, pointing at the grave. "The earth, it's warm, like something's moving underneath." Castellanos pressed his palm to the soil. Miguel was right. The earth pulsed with unnatural heat, and something beneath the surface was shifting, not settling, moving. The rosary around Maria's headstone began to rattle, its beads clicking together like castanets in the still morning air. "Maria was devout," Castellanos said, trying to make sense of the pattern. "She came to Mass every day, confessed regularly. Why would she be targeted?" But even as he spoke, he remembered. 3 months ago, Maria had confessed to him about her son, about knowing he was selling drugs, but saying nothing because the money helped pay for her medications. She had died carrying that guilt, never having made amends for her silence. The pattern was becoming clear. These weren't random victims. Someone or something was selecting souls who had died with unconfessed sins, marking them with these blood-stained rosaries like a supernatural scarlet letter. That afternoon, Father Castellanos researched the stolen rosaries. 7 different churches had reported thefts, all on the same night. Security cameras showed nothing, but each theft occurred during the exact moment when that church's evening prayers concluded. The rosaries taken were always the most beautiful, the most expensive, gifts from parishioners meant to honor God. The first death happened on a Thursday. Maria Vasquez was found at dawn by her daughter, who had come to place fresh flowers on her father's grave. Maria was kneeling beside her husband's headstone, a rosary wrapped around her throat so tightly it had cut into her flesh. The police called it suicide, but Castellanos knew better. Maria's hands bore deep cuts, defensive wounds from trying to remove the beads as they tightened on their own. The coroner's report mentioned something else. 13 rosary beads lodged in her throat, the exact number missing from every strand found in the cemetery. She fought it, Detective Morrison explained to Castellanos later that day. Fingernails broken, skin under her nails, like she was clawing at something. But here's the thing, Father. The rosary was so tight we had to cut it off. No way she could have tied it herself. That night, Castellanos decided to keep vigil. He positioned himself behind the Martinez family mausoleum with a clear view of the newer graves. Armed with his own rosary, a thermos of coffee, and a growing sense of dread, he settled in to wait. The cemetery at night was a different world. Sounds carried strangely, whispers that might have been wind, footsteps that could have been settling earth. The temperature dropped as darkness fell, but not evenly. Cold spots appeared randomly throughout the grounds, pockets of frigid air that made his breath steam. At 3:33 a.m. she appeared. Sister Magdalena emerged from the fog like a memory made flesh, her habit torn and bloody, her hands clutching dozens of rosary strands that writhed like serpents around her skeletal fingers. She had been dead for 50 years, but her hatred had kept her flesh from complete decay. Sister Magdalena moved between the graves with purpose, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel paths. The rosaries in her hands pulsed with their own light, a sickly green glow that cast dancing shadows across the headstones. Each strand seemed alive, the beads clicking together in a rhythm that matched a human heartbeat. Castellanos remembered the stories from old parish records, tales whispered by elderly parishioners who had known her in life. Sister Magdalena had been a force of nature, a nun who dedicated her life to reforming the unreformable. She worked with murderers, thieves, and prostitutes, believing that no soul was beyond salvation. Her faith had been her downfall. Ricardo Molina, a man she had tried desperately to reform, had strangled her with her own rosary during evening prayers in 1972. Her body was found 3 days later in the convent chapel, but 13 beads from her rosary were never recovered. The police assumed they had been taken as trophies by her killer. Now Castellanos understood the truth. Those 13 beads had been forced down her throat as she died, a final act of cruelty that had bound her spirit to the earthly realm. She had become something between martyr and demon, her desire for justice twisted into an instrument of supernatural vengeance. "You shouldn't be here, Father," she whispered without turning around. Her voice carried the rattle of rosary beads against bone, the sound of her original murder echoing through every word. "This is the devil's work, and I am his unwilling servant." Castellanos stepped forward, his own rosary burning hot against his palm. The blessed silver was reacting to her unholy presence, becoming almost too hot to hold. "Sister, your work here isn't God's will. These souls deserve peace, not vengeance." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with sobbing. When she finally turned to face him, Castellanos nearly lost his resolve. Her face was grey and mottled, the rope marks from her strangulation still visible around her throat. But her eyes burned with the fervor of the truly righteous, even in death. "Peace," she hissed. "I gave them the same peace they gave their victims." Maria Vasquez knew her son was poisoning children with drugs, and she said nothing. She chose comfort over courage, money over morality. "Tell me, Father, what sins are you carrying tonight?" The rosaries around her arms began to glow brighter, each bead pulsing like a tiny heart. Castellanos realized with growing horror that she could see into his soul, reading every secret shame he had ever carried. The supernatural light revealed not just his body, but his spirit, and all the darkness within it. "You see so much," Sister Magdalena continued, floating closer. Her feet had left the ground, the blood-stained hem of her habit trailing through the air like smoke. "You hear confessions every day, learning about abuse, corruption, violence, and you do nothing. You hide behind the seal of confession while evil flourishes. The temperature around them plummeted. Frost began forming on nearby headstones, spreading outward in perfect circles from where Sister Magdalena hovered. The grass beneath her withered and died, leaving brown patches in the otherwise green cemetery lawn. Castellanos could feel her power pressing against his mind, seeking entry. She wanted to know his secrets, to judge him as she had judged the others. The rosary in his hand grew hotter, the silver beginning to glow with its own light, a pure white radiance that pushed back against her sickly green aura. "I've heard confessions of abuse and done nothing," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've known about corruption in the church and stayed silent. I've failed in my duty to protect the innocent." Sister Magdalena's expression softened slightly, confusion replacing some of the hatred in her burning eyes. "Your guilt. It tastes different from the others. It carries the weight of genuine remorse." The rosaries in her hands stopped writhing. For a moment, she looked less like an avenging spirit and more like the devoted nun she had once been. The green light dimmed, allowing the natural moonlight to illuminate her ravaged features. "I died, believing God would grant me justice," she whispered. "Instead, He gave me vengeance. Every night, I hunt those who died with blood on their hands or silence on their lips. I strangle them as I was strangled, give them the death they deserved in life." Castellanos saw his opportunity. "Sister, vengeance isn't justice. It's just another form of sin. You're damning yourself with every soul you take." Her eyes flared with renewed fury. "Don't you dare preach to me about sin. I've seen what humans do when they think no one is watching. I've witnessed the evil that festers in hearts that claim to be pure. These people died unrepentant. They deserve no mercy." The rosaries began moving again, faster now, forming a writhing mass around her body like a nest of serpents. "You let him die," Sister Magdalena hissed, floating closer until her face was inches from Castellanos's. The smell of decay and old blood filled his nostrils, making him gag. "Little Tommy Rodriguez, you knew his father was beating him, and you said nothing. You kept the seal of confession while that child suffered." Castellanos's throat constricted as invisible hands wrapped around his neck. Not her hands, the rosary beads themselves moving with supernatural malice. Each bead felt like a burning coal against his skin, searing his flesh with the heat of divine judgment. I couldn't break the seal," he gasped, clawing at the spectral rosary that tightened with each word. "The church law forbids—" "Church law?" Sister Magdalena shrieked. "What about God's law? What about protecting the innocent? You chose your precious rules over a child's life." The beads tightened further, cutting into his throat and drawing blood. Castellanos could feel his vision beginning to blur as oxygen was cut off from his brain. Through his fading sight, he saw other figures rising from their graves, all the souls Sister Magdalena had claimed over the years, their own rosaries hanging like nooses around their necks. Maria Vasquez stood among them, her face blue and swollen from strangulation. Beside her was Father McKenna, who had embezzled from the orphanage fund. Behind them, dozens of others. Corrupt politicians, abusive parents, criminals who had died unrepentant. "Join us, Father," they whispered in unison, their voices creating a horrible harmony of the damned. "Join the guilty who pay for their silence." But as darkness closed in around the edges of his vision, Castellanos made a choice that would change everything. Instead of fighting the supernatural noose, he stopped struggling and spoke the words that had been burning in his heart for years. "I failed that boy," he whispered, his voice barely audible through his constricted throat. "God forgive me. I failed him. I failed them all." The beads stopped tightening. Sister Magdalena's eyes, hollow and black as empty sockets, suddenly filled with something that might have been tears. The supernatural assembly of the damned froze in place, as if his words had broken some fundamental rule of their existence. "Your guilt," Sister Magdalena said slowly, her voice losing its otherworldly echo. It tastes different from the others. It carries the weight of genuine remorse, not just fear of punishment. The rosary around Castellanos' neck loosened slightly, allowing him to breathe. As oxygen returned to his brain, he saw Sister Magdalena clearly for the first time. Beneath the decay and supernatural corruption, traces of the devoted nun she had once been were still visible. "I never sought absolution for my failures," Castellanos continued, his voice growing stronger. "I never confessed my cowardice because I knew it was unforgivable. But seeing you here, seeing what I've become, I understand now. We're both trapped by our inability to let go." Sister Magdalena's form began to waver, becoming translucent. The rosaries around her arms stopped moving, their supernatural animation fading. "I thought I was bringing justice," she whispered, "but I was only perpetuating the cycle of violence that killed me." The ghostly assembly behind her began to fade as well, their souls finally released from her supernatural hold. As they disappeared into whatever afterlife awaited them, each one looked at Castellanos with something resembling gratitude. "The boy," Sister Magdalena said, her voice now barely audible. "Tommy Rodriguez. What happened to him?" Castellanos closed his eyes, the memory still fresh after all these years. He died 3 days after his father's last confession. "Internal bleeding from a beating. I should have called the police, should have broken the seal. My silence killed him as surely as his father's fists." "And you've carried that guilt ever since," she observed. "Every day. Every confession I hear now, I wonder if I'm making the same mistake, choosing law over life, doctrine over duty." Sister Magdalena smiled then, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had in life. Young, hopeful, dedicated to serving others. "Perhaps that's the difference between us, Father. Your guilt has made you more compassionate. Mine made me into a monster." She reached out and touched the rosary around his neck. Instead of burning, the beads felt cool and soothing against his wounded throat. "Take this," she whispered, pressing a single bead into his palm. "The 13th bead from my original rosary, the one that bound me to this earth." As the bead touched his skin, Castellanos felt a weight lift from his soul, not the weight of his guilt, but the crushing burden of carrying it alone. "What do I do with it?" "Help others find the courage I never had," Sister Magdalena said, as her form dissolved into silver light. "Help them choose compassion over law when a life hangs in the balance." The cemetery fell silent. The supernatural cold dissipated, replaced by the natural warmth of a desert dawn. If these true stories of supernatural justice are keeping you awake tonight, subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're just getting started with these terrifying confessions from men of God. Now get ready, let's start story 3, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. There's something unnatural about a bell ringing when there's no bell to ring. That's what made Father Donnelly return to St. Helena's Parish in Savannah, Georgia, night after night, climbing the rotting stairs of the abandoned bell tower that hadn't housed a bell for 30 years. The calls started in November 2006, just 3 weeks after Donnelly's transfer from Atlanta. Parishioners swore they heard the tolling at exactly 3:13 a.m., deep, resonant peals that shook the windows of houses 6 blocks away. At first, Donnelly dismissed it as wind through the tower's hollow frame, maybe even planes passing overhead. But when he heard it himself, felt the vibrations in his bones like the pulse of some massive heart, he knew he was dealing with something far more sinister. The bell tower of St. Helena's stood like a skeletal finger against the night sky, its wooden frame weathered grey by decades of coastal storms. The stairs were treacherous, many planks rotted through or missing entirely. No sane person would climb them in daylight, much less in the dead of night. Yet something called to Donnelly every time the phantom bell tolled, and compulsion he couldn't resist. On his first investigation, Donnelly armed himself with heavy-duty flashlights, his smartphone to record any evidence, and his rosary, blessed by the Archbishop himself. The climb took 20 minutes, each step testing his nerve as the ancient wood creaked and sagged beneath his weight. At the top, he found exactly what he expected. Nothing. No bell, no rope, no mechanism that could produce sound. Just a square platform open to the elements, with gaps in the floorboards that offered glimpses of the cemetery 40 feet below. But there was something else. In the center of the platform, worn into the wood itself, was a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter. The wood inside the circle was darker than the surrounding planks, stained with something that looked suspiciously like old blood. When Donnelly knelt to examine it more closely, the stain felt warm to the touch, despite the November chill. The second night brought more calls. Mrs. Patterson from Magnolia Street swore the tolling had cracked her bedroom window. Old Mr. Chen, a veteran who'd survived the Korean War, said the sound reminded him of artillery fire, deep, powerful, and absolutely terrifying. By the third night, people were beginning to talk about moving away. Donnelly's investigation into the parish records revealed disturbing information about the tower's history. The original bell had been cast in 1847 using metal from cannons captured during the Mexican-American War. But the bell had never rung properly. Instead of clear, holy tones, it produced a sound so unsettling that children would scream and pregnant women would miscarry. The parish had it removed in 1852 and buried somewhere on the church grounds. More troubling was what happened to the last man to ring it. Brother Alexander Montrose, a Benedictine monk assigned to the parish, had been found dead in the tower in 1851. His body was discovered in that same circle, his throat crushed as if by an enormous weight. The coroner's report, written in faded ink, noted that his neck bore the impression of a rope, but no rope was found at the scene. The church hierarchy had declared Brother Alexander's death a suicide and buried him in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the cemetery. But the parish records contained a handwritten note from the parish priest of the time. Alexander died excommunicated, having practiced heretical rites. The bell was his instrument of damnation. God help us all if it ever sounds again. On the fourth night, Donnelly heard the tolling differently. Instead of the deep, resonant peals others described, he heard voices within the sound, dozens of them, all crying out in unison. They spoke in Latin, but the words were wrong, twisted. Instead of prayers, they were reciting blasphemies, inversions of sacred texts that made his skin crawl. He climbed the tower that night with grim determination. The wooden platform felt different in the darkness, larger somehow, as if the shadows were expanding the physical space. The blood-stained circle in the center was glowing faintly, pulsing with the same rhythm as the phantom bell. As he approached the circle, the temperature dropped so rapidly that his breath came out in great clouds of vapor. The wood beneath his feet began to creak and sag, but not from his weight. Something was pressing up from below, trying to break through the floorboards. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the tolling began again. But this time, Donnelly could see its source. In the center of the blood-stained circle, a spectral bell was materializing. Not solid, but real enough to cast shadows in his flashlight beam. The bell was wrong in every way possible. Instead of bronze or brass, it appeared to be made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light. Symbols were carved into its surface, not Christian iconography, but something far older and more sinister. As the spectral bell solidified, Brother Alexander Montrose stepped out of the shadows like a man emerging from deep water. His Benedictine robes were intact, but wrong. As the spectral bell solidified, Brother Alexander Montrose stepped out of the shadows like a man emerging from deep water. His Benedictine robes were intact but wrong. The brown fabric was stained black with old blood, and the rope belt around his waist had been fashioned into a noose that hung loose around his neck. His face was gray and bloated, the features of a man who had died by strangulation, but his eyes burned with unholy purpose. "Finally!" Brother Alexander rasped, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space of the tower. "Someone has come to witness the true Mass." Donnelly gripped his rosary tighter, the blessed silver burning hot against his palm. "You're excommunicated. You have no authority to conduct any mass." Brother Alexander laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Authority? I derived my authority from sources far older than Rome. The bell you see before you was cast not just with metal from cannons, but with something else, something the church tried to hide." The spectral bell began to glow with its own internal light, revealing the true horror of its construction. Embedded in the dark metal were what looked like bones, human bones, twisted and melted into the bell's structure. Donnelly could make out the curve of ribs, the hollow sockets of skulls, the delicate frameworks of children's hands. "Heretic bones," Brother Alexander continued, circling the bell like a predator stalking prey. "Burned witches from Salem, executed pagans from the Spanish Inquisition. Their remains were smuggled here and cast into the bell as a secret consecration, not to God, but to older powers." The monk's feet made no sound as he moved, but wherever he stepped, the wooden planks blackened and began to smolder. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and something else, the sickly sweet scent of roasting flesh. "I discovered the truth in 1851, Brother Alexander said, running his ghostly hands along the bell's surface. "I found the hidden records, learned about the bones. The church thought they were creating a weapon against evil, but they had actually forged a conduit for it." Donnelly tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't obey. The blood-stained circle beneath him had become sticky, tar-like, holding him in place. Through the gaps in the floorboards, he could see shapes moving in the cemetery below, the restless dead drawn by the bell's unholy song. "I tried to destroy it," Brother Alexander continued. "I rang the bell continuously for 3 days and nights, hoping to shatter it through resonance. Instead, I shattered something else, the barrier between worlds. And when they found me dead in this circle, they thought it was suicide. They never realized I had been murdered by the very spirits the bell had summoned." The spectral bell began to toll again, each peal sending waves of nausea through Donnelly's body. With each toll, more spirits materialized in the tower, the burned witches and executed pagans whose bones formed the bell's core. They surrounded the platform like a congregation of the damned, their hollow eyes fixed on Donnelly with hungry anticipation. "Now you will help me finish what I started," Brother Alexander declared. "You will ring the bell until it cracks this world open like an egg, releasing all the spirits that have been trapped in its metal for over a century." Now, Donnelly found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I won't help you damn this parish." "You don't have a choice," the monk replied. "The bell has already chosen you. From the moment you first heard its call, you were marked. Feel it in your hands, the compulsion to ring it to complete the ritual I died trying to finish." Donnelly looked down at his hands and gasped in horror. His fingers were moving on their own, reaching toward the spectral rope that hung from the bell. The rope wasn't made of hemp or cotton. It was braided human hair, still attached to fragments of scalp. The hair of women burned as witches, preserved in the bell's supernatural matrix. "Every night you've climbed these stairs, the compulsion has grown stronger," Brother Alexander observed with satisfaction. "Soon you won't be able to resist. You'll ring the bell until your hands bleed, until your heart stops, until you join me in this tower for eternity." The ghostly congregation began to chant in languages Donnelly didn't recognize, old tongues that predated Christianity, words that made the air itself seem to writhe and twist. The platform beneath his feet started to crack, long fissures spreading outward from the blood-stained circle. Through the gaps, Donnelly could see the cemetery coming alive. Graves were splitting open, disgorging their occupants in various states of decay. But these weren't the peaceful dead of St. Helena's. These were the restless spirits that had been drawn to the bell's power over the decades, trapped in its influence and waiting for someone to finally release them. "Ring it," Brother Alexander commanded, his voice taking on layers of otherworldly authority. "Ring it and set us all free." Donnelly's hands closed around the braided hair rope against his will. The moment his skin made contact, visions flooded his mind, memories that weren't his own. He saw the Salem witch trials through the eyes of the accused, felt the flames of the Inquisition's pyres, experienced the agony of death by torture and burning. The pain of centuries of religious persecution flowed through him like molten metal. "Yes," Brother Alexander whispered, his form becoming more solid as the bell's power grew. "Feel their suffering. Understand why they deserve freedom, why the church must pay for its crimes against the innocent." But as the borrowed memories crashed through his consciousness, Donnelly began to understand something the mad monk had missed. These weren't just innocent victims. Mixed among the genuinely persecuted were the truly guilty. Dark practitioners who had actually consorted with evil, murderers who had hidden behind accusations of witchcraft, corrupt inquisitors who had tortured for pleasure rather than faith. The bell wasn't just a conduit for the wrongfully executed, it was a prison for every soul touched by the religious conflicts of the past. Good and evil mingled together in supernatural chaos. Ringing it wouldn't bring justice. It would unleash an army of spirits driven mad by centuries of trapped rage. "You're wrong," Donnelly said, his voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "This isn't about justice. You're not freeing innocent souls. You're releasing every hateful spirit that ever died screaming God's name." Brother Alexander's face contorted with fury. "Don't presume to lecture me about justice. I've been trapped in this tower for over a century, watching corrupt priests live in comfort while I suffer for seeking truth." "You suffer because you chose damnation over faith," Donnelly replied, forcing his hands to release the rope. "You could have reported your discoveries to Rome, could have worked within the church to expose the truth. Instead, you chose the path of vengeance." The spectral bell began to toll faster, its peals becoming erratic and discordant. The ghostly congregation grew more agitated, their chanting rising to a fever pitch. Some began to fade, their connection to the physical world weakening as doubt crept into the ritual. "Ring the bell!" Brother Alexander shrieked, lunging toward Donnelly with ghostly hands extended. "Complete the ritual, or we'll drag you into damnation with us." But Donnelly had found his strength. Instead of grasping the rope, he pulled out his rosary and began to pray, not the formal Latin prayers of the church, but a simple plea from the heart. "Lord, help me find the wisdom to forgive even those who don't deserve it. Help these souls find peace, not through vengeance, but through mercy." The effect was immediate. Brother Alexander stumbled backward as if struck by a physical blow, his form wavering between solid and transparent. The ghostly congregation began to wail, not in anger but in anguish, as if they were remembering what they had lost in their quest for revenge. "No!" the monk gasped, his voice losing its otherworldly echo. "I won't be denied again. I won't let the church escape judgment for its crimes." "The church has already been judged," Donnelly said quietly. "Every day we face the consequences of our failures. Every scandal that emerges, every victim who speaks out, every crisis of faith, that's your justice, brother. The church is already paying for its sins through the loss of trust, the decline in faith, the emptiness of pews that once overflowed." The spectral bell began to crack, hairline fractures spreading across its supernatural surface. As it cracked, light poured out, not the sickly glow it had emitted before, but pure white radiance that seemed to wash away the darkness that had consumed the tower. One by one, the ghostly congregation began to dissolve, but now their faces showed peace rather than rage. As the light touched them, they remembered who they had been in life, not just victims or persecutors, but human beings capable of both good and evil, deserving of mercy rather than eternal torment. Brother Alexander was the last to fade. As the light reached him, his bloated features softened, revealing the young, idealistic monk he had once been. I just wanted to protect the innocent," he whispered, tears streaming down his translucent cheeks. "I know," Donnelly replied, "and maybe that's enough. The bell gave one final toll, not the discordant clang it had produced for over a century, but a clear, pure note that seemed to ring out across all of time. Then it shattered completely, its spectral fragments dissolving into points of light that drifted up through the tower's roof like ascending souls. The platform beneath Donnelly's feet solidified again, the blood-stained circle fading until it was just ordinary wood. The temperature returned to normal, and for the first time in decades, the tower felt empty of supernatural presence. As dawn broke over Savannah, Donnelly climbed down from the tower for the last time. The phantom tolling never returned to St. Helena's, and gradually the parishioners forgot about the bells that had terrorized their nights. But sometimes, on quiet Sunday mornings, when the church bells of Savannah ring out in harmony, locals swear they can hear an extra note in the chorus, a pure, clear tone that seems to carry a message of forgiveness across the centuries. 3 stories down, 9 more terrifying confessions to go. These priests thought they were prepared for anything evil could throw at them. They were wrong. Hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to hear what's coming next. Now get ready. Let's start story 4, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father Kowalski should never have followed the candles. He tells himself that every time he wakes up in a cold sweat, every time he sees the glow of candlelight where there shouldn't be any, because once you've seen them, once you've walked among them, they never really leave you. It was October 2011, and Kowalski was working on a story for the New Orleans Picayune about strange disappearances linked to the old Saint Germain cemetery. The assignment was meant to be Halloween filler, local legends and urban myths that made for good seasonal reading. He'd been digging into accounts of a ghostly funeral procession, a line of hooded figures carrying candles, moving silently through the cemetery at night. Some said they were lost souls searching for their final resting place. Others claimed they were spirits, reenacting an unfinished burial ritual from the yellow fever epidemic of 1853. The stories varied, but the details remained consistent. Always at night, always silent, always carrying candles that burned with an unusual blue flame. Kowalski had interviewed a dozen locals, each with their own version of the tale. Mrs. Boudreau swore she'd seen them from her apartment window, counting 23 figures in the procession. Tommy Hebert claimed they'd walked right through his car when he was driving past the cemetery at midnight, filling his vehicle with the scent of lilies and decay. The most credible witness was Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who lived across from the cemetery. She was rational, educated, not prone to flights of fancy, but even she spoke in hushed tones about the night she'd watched the procession from her bedroom window. They moved like they were underwater, she told Kowalski over coffee. Slow, deliberate, but not quite touching the ground. And the candles, they never flickered, never went out, even when the wind was howling. There's something deeply wrong about that place after midnight. St. Germain Cemetery was old, even by New Orleans standards, dating back to the 1780s. The above-ground tombs were typical of the city, necessary because of the high water table that made traditional burial impossible. But Saint-Germain had a darker history than most. During the yellow fever epidemic, it had been used as a mass burial site. Entire families had been interred in unmarked tombs, their names lost to disease and desperation. The cemetery records from that period were fragmentary at best. Kowalski had spent days in the city archives, piecing together the story of those desperate months when yellow fever killed 20% of the city's population. The dead were buried so quickly that proper funeral rites were often skipped entirely. Bodies were wrapped in shrouds and shoved into whatever tomb space was available. One entry in particular caught his attention. Father Auguste Morel, the parish priest during the epidemic, had written in his journal about a funeral procession that had gone horribly wrong. 23 members of the Delacroix family had died within a week, victims of the fever. Their funeral procession to Saint-Germain had been attacked by desperate survivors who blamed the wealthy family for bringing the disease to the city. The mourners, family, friends and servants, had been killed along with the priest conducting the service. Their bodies were thrown into an unmarked mass grave, their funeral rites left incomplete. According to Father Morel's journal, this violation of sacred burial customs had left the souls trapped between worlds, doomed to repeat their final journey until someone completed the interrupted ceremony. Kowalski might have dismissed it as historical curiosity, if not for one detail that chilled him to the bone. Father Morel's journal ended abruptly after the entry about the Delacroix funeral. Church records showed that he had vanished 3 days later, his body never found. The only clue was his cassock, discovered in Saint-Germain Cemetery, surrounded by 23 burned-down candles arranged in a circle. On October 30th, Kowalski decided to spend the night in the cemetery. He armed himself with digital cameras, audio recording equipment, and enough batteries to last until dawn. He positioned himself behind the largest mausoleum with a clear view of the cemetery's main pathways. The cemetery at night was a maze of shadows and pale stone. Mist rose from the damp ground, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made every sound seem amplified. The tombs loomed like small houses, their ornate facades decorated with weeping angels and religious symbols that seemed to watch him with stone eyes. At 12:03 a.m., exactly as Dr. Chen had described, he saw the first flicker of candlelight. A line of figures emerged from behind the tombs, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. Each figure wore a heavy black veil that obscured their features completely, and each held a candle that burned with that distinctive blue flame the witnesses had described. Kowalski began recording, his hands shaking with excitement and fear. This was it, definitive proof of the supernatural phenomenon that had haunted New Orleans for over a century. But as he watched through his camera's viewfinder, something made his blood run cold. At the front of the procession was an old woman clutching a funeral wreath, her gaze locked onto his position behind the mausoleum. Even through the heavy veil, he could feel her eyes on him. And then she smiled, a horrible, knowing expression that seemed to say she'd been waiting for him. "You're late, child," the old woman whispered, her voice carrying clearly across the cemetery despite the distance between them. The other figures in the procession stopped moving, their candles held high as they turned to face Kowalski's hiding place. Kowalski's finger froze on the camera's record button. Every instinct told him to run, to flee this place, and never return. But journalistic curiosity, that fatal flaw that had gotten so many reporters into trouble, kept him rooted in place. This was the story of a lifetime, proof of the supernatural that could make his career. The old woman began walking toward him, her movements unnaturally smooth, as if she was gliding rather than walking. As she drew closer, Kowalski could see that her funeral wreath was wrong. Instead of flowers, it was woven from yellowed newspaper clippings. And in the center, where a photograph of the deceased should have been, was a modern obituary printed on crisp white paper. "We've been waiting for you," she continued, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that reminded Kowalski of children's nursery rhymes. "Waiting so very long for someone to complete our procession." She held out the wreath, and Kowalski's camera automatically focused on the central obituary. The text was perfectly legible in the blue candlelight, and what he read made his heart stop. It was his own obituary. His name, his age, his occupation, all accurate. The death was listed as October 31st, 2011, tomorrow. The cause of death was described simply as lost to the eternal procession. "This isn't real," Kowalski stammered, lowering his camera with trembling hands. This is just my imagination. Mass hallucination, psychological suggestion from reading too many ghost stories." The old woman tilted her head, and for a moment her veil shifted enough to reveal what lay beneath. Kowalski bit back a scream. Her face was yellowed and mummified, her eye sockets empty except for tiny blue flames that flickered like candle flames. Her lips had rotted away, revealing teeth stained black with age and decay. "Oh, but it is real, dear one," she said, her voice now coming from those lipless jaws. "Death is always real, and tomorrow, when the sun sets on All Hallows' Eve, you will join our procession. You will carry a candle for eternity, walking the same path we have walked for over a century." The rest of the funeral procession began moving again, forming a circle around Kowalski's position. Up close, he could see that they were all wrong. Their proportions were off, their movements too fluid, their candles casting shadows that didn't match their positions. These weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were something else, something that had been twisted by their interrupted funeral rites into something neither living nor properly dead. "Why me?" Kowalski asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "What makes me special?" "You wrote about us," the old woman replied. "You dug into our story, learned our names, understood our suffering. In doing so, you became connected to us. Your research was the invitation we needed to finally claim you." Kowalski thought frantically about his investigation, trying to remember exactly what he had uncovered. He had read the original burial records, transcribed Father Morell's journal entries, even visited the city archives to examine newspaper accounts of the yellow fever epidemic. Had that really been enough to forge a supernatural connection? "Every person who has vanished near this cemetery was someone who learned too much about us," the old woman continued. "Historians, journalists, curiosity seekers who couldn't leave well enough alone. They all ended up joining our procession, carrying candles until the end of time. The circle of veiled figures began to close in, their blue flames casting dancing shadows on the tomb walls. Kowalski could smell them now, the sickly sweet scent of flowers mixed with the unmistakable odor of decay. But underneath those familiar death smells was something else, something that made his stomach clench with primitive fear. It was the smell of desperate hunger, of souls so starved for completion that they would consume anything to fill the void left by their interrupted funeral rites. "Please," Kowalski said, backing against the cold stone of the mausoleum. "There has to be another way. Some other way to complete your funeral, to give you the peace you're looking for." The old woman's hollow laugh echoed off the tomb walls. "Oh, there is, sweet child, but it requires a sacrifice. Someone must take the place of the priest who was killed during our original procession. Someone must complete the burial rites that were left unfinished." She gestured toward the center of the circle, where the other figures had begun arranging their candles in a complex pattern. In the flickering blue light, Kowalski could see that they were recreating the layout of a church, candles marking the positions of altar, pews, and pulpit. "You can run if you wish," the old woman said with mock kindness, "but you cannot escape what has already been written. Tomorrow night you will return to us, and our funeral will finally be complete." Kowalski ran. He burst through the circle of veiled figures, their cold hands grasping at him as he passed. The candles they held seemed to reach for him like living things, their blue flames stretching unnaturally in his direction. Behind him, he could hear the old woman's laughter echoing through the cemetery, a sound like wind through broken glass. He stumbled through the maze of tombs, his feet slipping on the damp ground as he fought to reach the cemetery gates. Every shadow seemed to hide another figure. Every flickering streetlight looked like another candle. The funeral procession wasn't chasing him. They didn't need to. They knew he would return. At his apartment, Kowalski locked every door and window, though he knew it was useless. The connection had been forged the moment he had read their story, the moment he had spoken their names aloud while transcribing Father Morell's journal. He was marked now, claimed by souls who had been waiting over a century for someone to complete their interrupted journey to the afterlife. He tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the procession. In his dreams, he walked among them, carrying his own blue candle, his face hidden beneath a heavy veil. He was part of their eternal funeral now, doomed to repeat the same journey night after night until someone else took his place. When he woke, it was October 31st, Halloween, the day of his scheduled death according to the obituary in the old woman's wreath. Kowalski spent the day researching frantically, looking for some way to break the supernatural contract he had inadvertently signed. He read about funeral rites, burial customs, anything that might give him a clue about how to satisfy the spirit's demands without sacrificing his own life. The answer came from an unexpected source: Father Morell's complete journal, which Kowalski found in the basement archives of the cathedral. The final entries, which hadn't been included in the cemetery records, described the priest's growing understanding of what the interrupted funeral had done to the Delacroix family and their mourners. "They are not evil," Father Morell had written in his final entry. "They are simply lost, trapped between worlds by the violence that cut short their sacred journey. They need someone to complete what was begun, to speak the words that will release them from their earthly bonds. But the one who speaks those words will take their place, becoming the guardian of this threshold between life and death." As night fell, Kowalski made his decision. He couldn't run from what was coming, but perhaps he could change its outcome. Armed with Father Morell's journal and a deep understanding of Catholic funeral rites, he returned to Saint-Germain Cemetery. The procession was waiting for him. 23 figures arranged in the same formation they had maintained for over a century, their candles burning with patient blue flames. The old woman stood at their head, her wreath of obituaries held ready. "You came back," she said, and for the first time her voice carried a note of surprise. "Most try to run until the very end." "I came back to finish what Father Morell started," Kowalski replied, walking toward the center of their circle. "I came back to give you the funeral you were denied." The old woman's empty sockets seemed to flicker with hope. "You understand the price? You know what this will cost you?" Kowalski nodded. "I'll take Father Morell's place as guardian of this threshold. But in return, you all get to rest. No more processions, no more waiting. Your funeral will be complete." The veiled figures began to move, repositioning themselves according to the sacred geometry of a proper funeral service. Kowalski found himself standing where the altar should be, Father Morell's journal open in his hands. In the blue candlelight, he began to read the Latin words that would finally lay these souls to rest. As he spoke, the cemetery began to change around them. The crumbling tombs seemed to repair themselves, becoming the walls of a spectral church. The candles multiplied, filling the space with warm light that gradually changed from blue to gold. The scent of lilies and decay was replaced by the familiar smell of incense and blessed candles. One by one, the veiled figures removed their coverings, revealing faces that were peaceful rather than tortured. They were no longer the desperate souls who had haunted the cemetery for over a century. They were simply people attending a funeral, finally able to say goodbye to their loved ones. The old woman was the last to reveal herself. Beneath her veil was the face of a young mother, probably no older than 30 when yellow fever had claimed her life. She smiled at Kowalski with genuine gratitude as she placed a single candle in his hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now we can rest." As dawn broke over New Orleans, the spectral church faded away, leaving Kowalski alone among the tombs. But he wasn't the same man who had entered the cemetery the night before. He could feel the change in himself, a connection to the threshold between worlds, a responsibility to guide lost souls to their final rest. The procession never walked again, but sometimes on quiet nights in Saint-Germain Cemetery, visitors report seeing a single figure with a golden candle, helping the recently departed find their way home. Now get ready, let's start story 5. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. Father Morrison had one rule when he started working at Oak Hill Cemetery in Evansville, Indiana, back in 1983. Never open the mausoleum at the edge of the woods. Mr. I. Grayson, The old groundskeeper, who'd been there for 30 years, had been very specific about that. "That door's been sealed for a reason," Grayson had said on Morrison's first day, pointing to the small stone building that sat apart from the main cemetery grounds. "Whatever you do, don't go poking around in there. Some things are better left undisturbed." Morrison had laughed at the time, thinking the old man was just trying to spook the new priest. But there was something about the way Grayson's hands shook when he talked about the mausoleum, something in his eyes that suggested he'd seen more than he was willing to share. The mausoleum itself was unremarkable, a simple stone structure maybe 10 feet square, with a heavy iron door secured by an old-fashioned latch. No nameplate, no indication of who might be entombed inside. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by oak trees, just far enough from the main cemetery that visitors rarely noticed it. For the first few months, Morrison followed the rule without question. Early mornings were spent maintaining the grounds, late evenings conducting funeral services for the recently departed. The work was peaceful, predictable, exactly what he needed after the chaos of his previous assignment in downtown Chicago. But every once in a while, Morrison would notice something odd about the mausoleum. The door would be slightly ajar, not wide open, just a crack, like someone had tried to step out but changed their mind at the last moment. At first, he figured it was just settling stone, or maybe an animal had somehow gotten inside. The iron latch was old and probably didn't hold as securely as it once had. The first time he found it open, Morrison did exactly what he was supposed to do. He walked over and shut it firmly, making sure the latch clicked into place. The door was heavier than he expected, requiring real effort to move. Inside, he caught a glimpse of a single child-sized coffin, its lid slightly askew. The sight sent an unexpected chill through him, though he couldn't say why. The next morning, the door was open again. Same position, same narrow gap. Morrison closed it again, this time checking the latch more carefully. It seemed secure, showing no signs of rust or mechanical failure. Yet the following day, there it was again. That same unsettling crack of darkness. After a week of this pattern, Morrison began to dread his morning rounds. There was something about that slightly open door that felt wrong on a fundamental level, like seeing a person's mouth hanging open while they slept. It suggested something unfinished, something waiting. The whispers started on a Thursday. Morrison was cleaning headstones near the main entrance when he heard it, a soft, plaintive sound drifting from the direction of the mausoleum. At first, he thought it might be wind through the trees, but the air was still that day. As he listened more carefully, he realized it wasn't random noise. It was a voice, young and desperate, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. That night, Morrison decided to investigate. Armed with a heavy-duty flashlight and his rosary, he approached the mausoleum just as the sun was setting. The door was closed, latch secure, exactly as he'd left it that morning. But as he drew closer, he could hear something from inside, a soft scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. "Hello?" he called out, feeling foolish. "Is someone in there?" The scratching stopped immediately, replaced by absolute silence. Morrison waited, his heart beating faster than the situation seemed to warrant. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, came a response. "You left me." Morrison's blood ran cold. The voice was that of a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, speaking with the kind of accusatory tone that only comes from deep hurt. But there couldn't be a living child inside a sealed mausoleum. The logical explanation was that some neighborhood kid was playing a prank, though Morrison couldn't figure out how they would have gotten inside. "Who's there?" Morrison asked, his hand moving instinctively to the door latch. "Are you hurt? Do you need help?" "You left me," the voice repeated, louder this time. "You promised you wouldn't leave me, but you did. You left me in the dark." Morrison's hand froze on the latch. The voice carried a weight of grief and abandonment that seemed far too real for a child's prank. But more than that, there was something familiar about it. Not the voice itself, but the words, the tone, the specific way the accusation was delivered. With growing horror, Morrison realized where he'd heard those exact words before. 30 years ago, in Chicago, from a little boy named Timothy, whose father had been beating him. Morrison had been the boy's confessor, had heard the father admit to the abuse during confession, and Morrison had done nothing, bound by the seal of confession, even as he watched the boy's bruises grow worse each week. Timothy had died 3 days after his father's final confession, internal bleeding from a particularly savage beating. The last thing he'd said to Morrison was those exact words. "You left me. You promised you wouldn't leave me, but you did." Morrison's hand trembled as he lifted the latch. The iron felt ice cold despite the warm evening air, and the metal seemed to burn his palm with supernatural cold. Inside, his flashlight beam revealed exactly what he'd glimpsed before: a child-sized coffin, its white painted surface marred by long scratch marks. But the coffin wasn't closed. The lid had been pushed aside, revealing yellowed satin lining and nothing else. No body, no remains, just an empty space that seemed to yawn like an open mouth in the darkness. "Timothy," Morrison whispered, though he knew it was impossible. Timothy had been buried in Chicago, in a cemetery 300 miles away. There was no way the boy's remains could be here, in this unmarked mausoleum in Indiana. "You remember my name," came the voice from somewhere in the darkness behind him. Morrison spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the small space. The mausoleum appeared empty, except for the coffin, but the voice had been close, intimate, as if the speaker was standing right beside him. "I remember everything about you, Father Morrison. How you used to smile when I came to see you. How you promised you would help me. How you said everything would be okay." Morrison's legs felt weak. He leaned against the stone wall, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "Timothy, I wanted to help you, but I couldn't break the seal of confession. Church law forbade it. Church law." The voice carried a bitterness that no child should possess. "You chose your precious rules over my life. You let him kill me because your book said you had to." The temperature in the mausoleum plummeted. Morrison's breath began coming out in visible puffs, and frost started forming on the inside walls. The scratching sound resumed, but now Morrison could see its source. Claw marks appearing in the stone walls, as if invisible fingers were dragging across the surface. "I waited for you," Timothy continued, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "After I died, I waited. I thought you would come to my funeral, would say prayers for me, would finally do something to help, but you didn't come. You stayed away because you were ashamed." Morrison closed his eyes, the memory washing over him like ice water. He had stayed away from Timothy's funeral, unable to face the boy's mother, unable to confront his own failure. He'd told himself it was for the best, that his presence would only cause more pain, but the truth was simpler and more damning. He'd been a coward. "I'm sorry," Morrison whispered. "I failed you. I failed in my duty to protect the innocent." "A sorry isn't enough," Timothy replied. And now Morrison could see him, a translucent figure materializing in the corner of the mausoleum. The boy looked exactly as he had in life, but his eyes held knowledge no child should possess, the terrible wisdom of someone who had died in agony and fear. "I've been waiting here, Father, waiting for you to find me, to finally do what you should have done when I was alive. But it's too late now." "Too late for me, and sorry isn't enough," Timothy replied, and now Morrison could see him, a translucent figure materializing in the corner of the mausoleum. The boy looked exactly as he had in life, but his eyes held knowledge no child should possess, the terrible wisdom of someone who had died in agony and fear. "I've been waiting here, Father, waiting for you to find me, to finally do what you should have done when I was alive. But it's too late now, too late for me, and too late for you." Morrison's flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker with each pulse. In the failing light, he could see other shapes moving in the shadows. More children, dozens of them, all bearing the unmistakable signs of abuse and neglect. Silent witnesses to the failures of those who should have protected them. "They're all here," Timothy said, gesturing to the growing crowd of ghostly children. Every child who died because someone like you chose silence over action. Every innocent soul who suffered while their protectors looked the away. The scratching sounds intensified, and Morrison realized they weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were coming from beneath the mausoleum, from the earth itself. Something was digging its way up from below, clawing through 6 feet of packed soil with desperate determination. "Or what do you want from me?" Morrison asked, though he was beginning to understand that this encounter had been inevitable from the moment he'd taken the position at Oak Hill Cemetery. "I want you to feel what I felt," Timothy replied, his form becoming more solid, more real. "I want you to know what it's like to be trapped, helpless, while someone who could save you chooses not to act." The scratching reached a crescendo, and suddenly the floor of the mausoleum cracked open. From the fissure emerged a skeletal hand clutching an old shovel, its wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. Carved into the wood were initials, not Morrison's initials, but those of every groundskeeper who had worked at Oak Hill Cemetery over the years. "Do you see it, Father?" Timothy asked, floating closer. "Do you see your name?" Morrison looked at the shovel handle with growing horror. There, freshly carved as if the wood had just been cut, were his own initials. FM, Father Morrison. The letters seemed to pulse with their own dark light, marking him as the next in a long line of failed protectors. "Every groundskeeper who worked here had a choice," Timothy explained. "Every one of them encountered a child who needed help, and every one of them chose silence. Mr. Grayson, who was here before you, knew about the mausoleum because he put me here. He moved my remains from Chicago after you failed me, thinking distance would ease his guilt." Morrison's knees buckled. The full scope of the supernatural conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Timothy. This was about a generational cycle of failure, of adults who chose institutional loyalty over the welfare of children. "The shovel chooses its bearer," Timothy continued. "It passes from one guilty conscience to another, marking those who have innocent blood on their hands. You've been chosen, Father Morrison. You'll take Mr. Grayson's place as guardian of this mausoleum, keeper of all the children who died because someone failed to act." The skeletal hand released the shovel, and it clattered to the floor at Morrison's feet. The moment it touched the ground, visions flooded his mind, images of every child who had suffered while he maintained his silence, every small victim whose abuse he could have prevented if he'd had the courage to break the seal of confession. Morrison reached for the shovel with hands that no longer felt like his own. The moment his fingers closed around the worn wooden handle, the connection was complete. He could feel the weight of every child's death, every moment of suffering that could have been prevented by someone willing to break an unjust rule. "Now you understand," Timothy said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "Now you know what it feels like to be powerless while someone else holds your fate in their hands." And the visions intensified. Morrison saw Mr. Grayson 30 years earlier, kneeling in this same mausoleum, accepting the same burden from the ghost of a different child. Before Grayson, there had been others, a chain of guilt stretching back generations, each groundskeeper chosen because they carried the blood of innocence on their conscience. "But there's more to it than guilt," Timothy continued, his form becoming even more solid. "The shovel doesn't just mark you, it compels you. Every night, you'll feel the urge to dig. You'll search for more children who need proper burial, more victims who were discarded and forgotten, and you'll bring them here to rest with us." Morrison tried to drop the shovel, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The tool had fused with his hands somehow, becoming an extension of his body. Already he could feel the compulsion Timothy had described, a burning need to dig, to uncover, to give proper burial to those who had been denied it in life. "Mr. Grayson tried to resist at first," Timothy said with the casual cruelty of a child discussing a broken toy. "He thought he could ignore the calling, could live a normal life despite carrying the shovel. But the compulsion grew stronger each night until he had no choice but to give in. Images flashed through Morrison's mind. Grayson sneaking into cemeteries across 3 states, digging up the unmarked graves of abused children, carefully transporting their remains to the mausoleum at Oak Hill. Over 30 years, he had assembled a congregation of the forgotten dead, giving them a resting place where their suffering would be remembered. "Why?" Morrison gasped, fighting against the supernatural compulsion that was already taking hold of his will. Why perpetuate this cycle? Why not find peace and move on? Timothy's expression softened slightly, revealing glimpses of the innocent child he had once been. "Because someone has to remember us, Father. Someone has to carry the weight of our deaths, to ensure that our suffering meant something. The adults who failed us get to live normal lives, forget about us, move on. But we don't get that luxury. We're trapped here by the violence that ended our lives." The other ghostly children began to speak, their voices creating a chorus of accusation and sorrow. Each one told a story of betrayal by the adults who should have protected them, teachers who ignored signs of abuse, social workers who didn't follow up on reports, priests who chose institutional loyalty over child welfare. "You'll spend the rest of your life serving us," Timothy said, his voice taking on the authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Every night you'll dig. Every morning you'll tend to our graves. And when you finally die, worn out by years of supernatural servitude, the shovel will choose someone new." Morrison looked around the mausoleum, seeing it now for what it truly was. Not just a tomb, but a tribunal where the guilty were judged by their victims. The children's faces surrounded him, each one a reminder of the choices he had made and the lives those choices had cost. "I accept," Morrison said quietly, the words seeming to come from someone else's mouth. "I accept the responsibility for my failures." The moment he spoke those words, the supernatural pressure in the mausoleum lifted slightly. The children's expressions became less accusing, more sad than angry. Timothy stepped forward and placed a translucent hand on Morrison's shoulder. "Thank you," the boy whispered. "It doesn't absolve you of guilt, but it's more than most adults are willing to do. You'll care for us now, give us the attention we never received in life." Morrison nodded, feeling the full weight of his new burden settling onto his shoulders. The shovel in his hands grew warm, pulsing with purpose. He could sense locations across the country where forgotten children lay in unmarked graves, waiting for someone to remember them. As dawn broke over Oak Hill Cemetery, Morrison began his new duties. He dug Timothy's grave first, creating a proper resting place marked with a simple headstone that bore the boy's name and dates. Then he moved on to the others, giving each child the dignity and death they had been denied in life. Years later, visitors to Oak Hill Cemetery would comment on the beautiful children's section that had appeared seemingly overnight. Dozens of small graves, each tended with loving care, each marked with fresh flowers and carefully maintained headstones. The groundskeeper, they noted, seemed particularly devoted to these graves, spending hours each day ensuring they were perfect. What they didn't know was that Morrison wasn't just a groundskeeper, he was a guardian, protecting the eternal rest of children who had finally found someone willing to put their needs first. And when his own time came, the shovel would choose another guardian, ensuring that the cycle of remembrance continued forever. The mausoleum door never opened unexpectedly again. It didn't need to. Its purpose had been fulfilled. Now get ready. Let's start story 6. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father Brennan should have known something was wrong the moment he found the portrait. It was tucked away in the deepest corner of St. Catherine's Rectory basement in Pittsburgh, covered with a moth-eaten cloth that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. But what made his skin crawl was the silence. The moment he entered that corner of the basement, all sound seemed to die away, as if the air itself was holding its breath. It was the winter of 1997, and Brennan had just taken over the struggling parish. St. Catherine's had been hemorrhaging parishioners for years, its congregation shrinking as younger families moved to the suburbs. The bishop had assigned him to either revitalize the church or prepare it for closure. Cataloguing the rectory's accumulated treasures was part of his effort to raise funds and reconnect with the parish's history. The basement was filled with the detritus of decades: old missals, broken pews, religious statuary in various states of repair. But this portrait was different. Even covered, it seemed to radiate a presence that made Brennan's rosary grow uncomfortably warm against his chest. When he finally worked up the courage to pull away the cloth, he immediately understood why someone had tried to hide it. The painting depicted a nobleman from the early 19th century, tall and aristocratic, with sharp, angular features. His dark eyes seemed to follow Brennan as he moved around the portrait, an optical illusion that was unsettlingly effective. The man's hands were folded in prayer, a golden crucifix hanging from his pale fingers. The detail was extraordinary, every crease in the skin, every thread in the elaborate clothing rendered with photographic precision. But there was something wrong with the face. The expression was too intense, too alive for a mere painting. The eyes held a depth of suffering that seemed to go beyond what any artist could capture on canvas. And there was something else. Around the nobleman's neck, barely visible in the shadows of his high collar, were dark marks that looked disturbingly like bruises. The brass nameplate at the bottom of the ornate frame read, "Lord William Gothier, 1789-1824. Brennan searched the church records but found no mention of the man. No donation logs, no historical documents, nothing to explain how or why his portrait had ended up in the basement of a Catholic church in Pittsburgh. That first night, Brennan was awakened by the sound of sobbing. It was soft at first, distant, like someone crying behind a closed door. He assumed it was one of the elderly parishioners who sometimes came to the church late at night to pray for departed spouses. But as he listened more carefully, the sound seemed to be coming from directly below his bedroom, from the basement where he'd found the portrait. The next morning, when Brennan went to examine the painting again, he stopped cold at the entrance to the storage room. There were teardrops on the portrait's surface, not condensation from the damp basement air, but actual tears streaming down the painted cheeks of Lord William Gothier. Brennan touched one of the droplets with a trembling finger. It was warm, body temperature, and had the consistency of real tears. He wiped it away with his handkerchief, telling himself it had to be some kind of moisture problem in the basement. Old buildings were notorious for humidity issues, and perhaps the paint was reacting to changes in atmospheric pressure. But even as he rationalized the phenomenon, he couldn't shake the feeling that the nobleman's expression had changed. The painted eyes seemed more desperate now, the mouth slightly more open as if trying to speak. The hands that had been peacefully folded in prayer now appeared to be clutching the crucifix with white-knuckled desperation. The crying returned that night, louder this time. Brennan woke to the sound at exactly 2:47 a.m., the muffled sobs bleeding through the floorboards of his room, deep, sorrowful wails that spoke of centuries of accumulated grief. This time he couldn't convince himself it was a late-night visitor. The church was locked, the alarm system armed, and the sounds were definitely coming from the basement. Armed with a flashlight and his courage, Brennan crept down to the storage room. The portrait was exactly where he'd left it, but now the tears were flowing freely down the painted face. Fresh streaks ran from the nobleman's eyes to his chin, and more were forming even as Brennan watched. "My God," he whispered, making the sign of the cross. "What are you trying to tell me?" As if responding to his words, the painted lips moved, just slightly, but enough to make Brennan's heart skip a beat. The nobleman was trying to speak, but no sound emerged from the canvas. Instead, more tears flowed, and Brennan noticed something else that made his blood run cold. The tears weren't clear anymore. They were dark, viscous, with the unmistakable color and consistency of blood. "Help me," the painted lips mouthed, though no sound accompanied the movement. Lord William Gothier's eyes fixed on Brennan with desperate intensity. the bloody tears flowing faster now, staining the ornate frame beneath the portrait. Brennan stumbled backward, his flashlight beam wavering. This was impossible. Paint couldn't move, couldn't bleed, couldn't communicate. But as he watched, the nobleman's entire posture was changing. The hands that had been clasped in prayer were now pressed against his chest, fingers digging into the fabric of his painted coat as if trying to tear it away. "You're not real," Brennan whispered, his voice barely audible in the oppressive silence of the basement. "This is just stress, hallucination, something." But even as he spoke, he could smell it, the metallic scent of fresh blood, so strong it made his stomach clench. The temperature in the storage room plummeted, and Brennan's breath began coming out in visible puffs. Frost formed on the nearby walls, but the portrait itself remained warm to the touch, as if heated from within by some supernatural fire. The nobleman's mouth opened wider, and this time Brennan could hear him, a whisper so faint it might have been the wind, but unmistakably human. "Finish my prayer." "What prayer?" Brennan asked, feeling foolish for speaking to a painting but unable to stop himself. "I don't understand what you're trying to tell me." The bloody tears flowed faster, and the painted figure's expression twisted into one of agonizing desperation. The crucifix in his hands began to glow with a sickly light, and Brennan could see that it wasn't made of gold, as he'd first thought. It was silver, tarnished black with age, and hanging from it was something that made his heart race, a rosary with several beads missing. "I was murdered," the nobleman whispered, his voice growing slightly stronger. "Murdered while at prayer. My soul was torn from my body before I could finish my final confession to God. I've been trapped in this portrait for nearly 2 centuries, unable to find peace." Brennan forced himself to step closer, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. "Who murdered you? Why?" The painted eyes closed in pain, and when they opened again, they held such profound sadness that Brennan felt tears forming in his own eyes. "My servants. They discovered my activities, the children I had been entertaining. They killed me before I could seek God's forgiveness for my sins." A wave of nausea swept over Brennan as the full implication of the nobleman's words sank in. Lord William Gauthier hadn't been an innocent victim. He'd been a predator, someone who had abused children and died before he could confess his crimes. But even pedophiles deserved the chance at salvation, didn't they? Even the most depraved souls could find redemption through genuine repentance. "You want me to hear your confession," Brennan said, understanding flooding through him. "You want me to give you the absolution you never received in life." The nobleman nodded frantically, hope flickering in his painted eyes. "Yes, yes, Father, please. I have carried the weight of my unconfessed sins for 200 years. I know I don't deserve mercy, but I beg you, let me speak my crimes aloud, so that God might finally judge me." Brennan hesitated. The church taught that all souls deserved the chance at redemption, but something about this felt wrong. The portrait radiated an aura of malevolence that seemed to grow stronger as the nobleman became more animated. The bloody tears weren't just tears, they were warnings, signs of the corruption that had consumed this man's soul. "Your crimes," Brennan said carefully. "Tell me about your crimes." The nobleman's expression became eager, almost hungry. "The children, Father. So many beautiful children. I collected them, you see, brought them to my estate for special purposes. They trusted me because I was a lord, because their parents thought associating with nobility would improve their station in life." Brennan's stomach churned as more details poured forth. Lord William described his acts with a perverse pride that suggested no genuine repentance. He spoke of the children not as victims deserving compassion, but as possessions he had enjoyed. This wasn't confession. It was boasting. "How many?" Brennan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Dozens," the nobleman replied with satisfaction. "Over the course of 20 years, I enjoyed the company of dozens of young ones. Their screams were like music, Father, their tears sweeter than wine. The portrait began to change more dramatically now. The nobleman's face was becoming more animated, more alive, as if speaking his crimes aloud was feeding some dark energy within the painting. The bloody tears stopped flowing, replaced by something far worse, a predatory smile that revealed teeth stained red with children's blood. Brennan realized with growing horror that this wasn't about redemption at all. The nobleman wasn't seeking forgiveness, he was seeking release. And if Brennan gave him absolution, he would be setting loose something that had been mercifully contained for 2 centuries. "Absolve me, Father," Lord William demanded, his painted form now moving with fluid grace within the confines of the canvas. "Speak the words that will free my soul from this prison." Brennan backed away from the portrait, his hand instinctively reaching for his rosary. "I can't absolve you. You're not truly repentant. You glory in your crimes, take pleasure in remembering the children you hurt. Absolution requires genuine remorse." The nobleman's expression darkened, the predatory smile widening to reveal more of those blood-stained teeth. "You cannot deny me the sacrament, priest. Your own doctrine demands that you offer forgiveness to any who seek it. Only to those who are truly sorry for their sins," Brennan replied, his voice growing stronger as his resolve hardened. "You're not sorry, you're proud. You want absolution not because you seek God's mercy, but because you want to escape the consequences of your actions." The temperature in the storage room dropped even further, and the portrait began to emit its own sickly light. Lord William's form pressed against the boundaries of the canvas as if trying to break free from its painted prison. His hands, no longer holding the crucifix, reached toward Brennan with grasping, desperate fingers. "You don't understand," the nobleman hissed, his voice taking on harmonics that hurt Brennan's ears. "I've been trapped in this painting for 2 centuries, reliving every moment of my death over and over again. My servant's hands around my throat, choking the life from my body while I tried to pray. The pain, the terror, the inability to breathe. I experience it all again every single night." Brennan saw the dark marks around the nobleman's painted neck more clearly now. They weren't bruises, they were rope burns, the marks left by a noose. Lord William hadn't been murdered in a moment of passion. He'd been deliberately executed by people who had discovered his crimes and decided to take justice into their own hands. "They hanged you," Brennan said with sudden understanding. "Your servants found out what you were doing to the children and they hanged you." "They had no right," Lord William screamed, his voice now clearly audible without any need for lip reading. "I was their lord, their betters. They were supposed to serve me, not judge me." The portrait began to shake on the wall, the frame rattling against the stone basement walls. Other objects in the storage room started to move, candlesticks rolling across tables, religious statuary tilting at impossible angles. The supernatural energy radiating from the painting was affecting everything in its vicinity. "The children you abused," Brennan said, standing his ground despite the chaos erupting around him. "Where are they buried? What happened to their bodies?" For the first time, Lord William's confidence wavered. That's not important. What matters is my soul, my salvation. I demand that you absolve me of my sins." "You don't even remember their names, do you?" Brennan pressed. "You used them and discarded them, and now you can't even remember who they were." The nobleman's painted form writhed in frustration. "They were nothing. Peasant children, street orphans, the unwanted spawn of whores and beggars. I gave their miserable lives meaning by allowing them to serve my pleasures." Brennan felt a cold rage building in his chest. This creature, for that's what Lord William was now, a creature of pure selfishness and evil, felt no remorse for his victims. He only cared about his own suffering, his own desire to escape the consequences of his actions. "I won't absolve you," Brennan said firmly, "and I won't help you escape the prison you've earned through your crimes." Lord William's face contorted with fury. "Then you'll share my fate, priest. If I cannot have absolution, I'll drag you into this portrait with me. You'll spend eternity experiencing my death, feeling what it's like to hang by the neck while your lungs burn for air." The nobleman's painted hands burst through the surface of the canvas, becoming three-dimensional as they reached for Brennan's throat. But as the supernatural fingers closed around his neck, Brennan spoke words he had never expected to say. "I forgive your victims," he gasped. "I grant peace to the children you hurt. Absolution for any sins they imagined they carried because of what you did to them. May they find rest in God's grace." The effect was immediate and devastating. Lord William screamed, not in triumph, but in agony, as bright light erupted from the portrait. The painted hands around Brennan's neck dissolved, and the nobleman's form began to wither and crack like old parchment. "No!" Lord William shrieked. "You can't absolve them. They were mine. Their suffering belongs to me." But the light continued to grow, and in its radiance Brennan could see other figures, translucent forms of children stepping out of the brightness. They were the nobleman's victims, finally freed from whatever supernatural hold he had maintained over them, even in death. The portrait crumbled to dust, Lord William's final scream echoing through the basement as his painted prison collapsed. When the light faded, only an empty frame remained, and the storage room felt clean for the first time in centuries. Brennan never found out what happened to the children's bodies, but sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings, he swore he could hear the sound of young voices joining the church choir, a ghostly harmony of souls finally at peace. 6 terrifying confessions down, 6 more spine-chilling stories to go. These priests thought their faith would protect them from evil, but sometimes evil wears the face of innocence. Smash that subscribe button and ring the bell if you dare to hear what horrors await. Now get ready, let's start story 7. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father Mackenzie first heard the howling on a Tuesday night in October 1980, a sound so mournful and unnatural that it woke him from deep sleep and left him trembling in his bed. It wasn't the wind. He'd lived in New Hampshire long enough to know every sound the mountain air could make. This was something else entirely, a deep guttural wail that seemed to rise from the earth itself, carrying with it the weight of inconsolable sorrow. St. Benedict's Parish sat in a valley surrounded by ancient pine forests, its cemetery stretching back into the woods where the oldest graves lay forgotten beneath decades of fallen leaves. Mackenzie had been the parish priest for 3 years, long enough to know every corner of the consecrated ground, every headstone and monument. But the howling was coming from the oldest section, where the stones were weathered smooth and many of the names had been erased by time. The next morning, Mackenzie walked the cemetery grounds looking for some explanation. Wild animals sometimes wandered down from the mountains, and perhaps an injured creature had taken shelter among the graves. But what he found was far more disturbing than any wounded animal. In the oldest section of the cemetery, where the trees grew thick and the morning sun barely penetrated the canopy, was an unmarked grave that Mackenzie had never noticed before. Not because it was hidden, but because it seemed to actively avoid attention, like a blind spot in his vision that only became visible when he focused directly on it. The grave was wrong in every way. While the surrounding plots were neat rectangles marked by proper headstones, this was a rough oval of disturbed earth that looked as if it had been dug by hand or by claws. Deep gouges scarred the ground around its perimeter, spiral patterns that suggested something had been circling the grave for a very long time. But most unsettling were the scratch marks. Long, deep furrows in the earth that ran from the edges of the grave toward its center, as if something had been trying to dig its way out from below. The scratches were fresh, filled with dark soil that looked almost black in the filtered sunlight. Mackenzie knelt beside the disturbed earth, his knees sinking slightly into the soft ground. The soil felt wrong beneath his weight, too loose, too yielding, as if it wasn't properly packed. When he pressed his palm against the earth, he could feel a faint vibration, like a distant heartbeat, or the rumbling of some massive engine running deep underground. That's when he heard it in daylight, for the first time, a low, muffled scratching sound coming from directly beneath his hand. Not the random scrabbling of insects or worms, but deliberate, rhythmic scratching, like fingernails dragging against wood. Mackenzie jerked his hand away and scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching continued for several more seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of wind through the pine trees and his own labored breathing. He spent the rest of the day researching the cemetery records, looking for any information about unmarked graves in the oldest section. The parish archives went back to 1847, when St. Benedict's had first been established, but there were gaps in the records, years when no proper burial logs had been kept, times when the parish had been without a priest, and the local community had handled burials themselves. What he found in the fragmentary records chilled him to the bone. In 1923, there had been a series of violent deaths in the area. A family of 4 found dead in their cabin, their bodies so mutilated that the local sheriff had suspected wild animal attacks. But the description in the sheriff's report didn't match any known predator. The wounds were too precise, too systematic, as if made by someone who knew exactly how to cause maximum pain. The family had been buried quickly and quietly, their grave left unmarked because no one in the community wanted to be associated with the horrific deaths. The sheriff's report mentioned unnatural circumstances and evidence of ritual mutilation, but provided no further details. More disturbing was a note written in the parish priest's own hand. The Hartwell family was laid to rest in unconsecrated ground at the community's insistence. God forgive us, but there was something wrong with their deaths. Something that suggested they had invited evil into their home. The grave must never be marked, never blessed, never acknowledged. That night, the howling returned with renewed intensity. Mackenzie lay in his bed, rosary clutched in his sweating palms, listening to the unearthly sound that seemed to seep through the floorboards and walls of the rectory. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was multiple voices, harmonizing in a chorus of anguish that made his soul ache with sympathetic pain. At exactly 3:33 a.m. the howling stopped. In the sudden silence, Mackenzie heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of digging, of metal striking earth coming from the direction of the cemetery. Mackenzie grabbed his heaviest flashlight and a shovel from the rectory's tool shed, though he couldn't have explained why he thought he'd need the shovel. Something was compelling him toward the cemetery, a pull he couldn't resist, even though every rational thought screamed at him to lock his doors and call the police. The unmarked grave was easy to find in the darkness. It glowed with a faint, sickly phosphorescence that made the disturbed earth look like an infected wound in the forest floor. The scratching sounds were louder now, more urgent, accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices calling out from deep underground. But Mackenzie wasn't alone in the cemetery. A figure knelt beside the grave, digging frantically with bare hands, throwing clods of dark earth aside with supernatural strength. The person, if it was a person, was dressed in the rotted remains of what might once have been a nightgown, the fabric hanging in tatters from a skeletal frame. "Excuse me," Mackenzie called out, his voice barely steady. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The figure stopped digging and slowly turned toward him. In the glow of his flashlight, Mackenzie saw a face that had been beautiful once, but was now ravaged by decay and madness. The woman's eyes were milky white with cataracts, but somehow she could still see him. Her lips had rotted away, revealing teeth stained black with old blood. "They buried us wrong," she whispered, her voice like autumn leaves scraping across stone. "They put us in the ground without last rites, without blessing, without even a prayer. We've been clawing our way up for 60 years, trying to reach consecrated soil." Mackenzie's flashlight beam played across the disturbed earth, and he could see that the hole she'd been digging was much deeper than it should have been. at least 6 feet down, with wooden planks visible at the bottom, the remains of a coffin that had been clawed apart from the inside. "Who are you?" Mackenzie asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. "Mary Hartwell," the woman replied, resuming her frantic digging, "and these are my children, my husband. We've been trapped down there, buried alive in unconsecrated ground because the townspeople thought we were evil. But we weren't evil, Father. We were the victims." More scratching sounds emerged from the hole, and Mackenzie could see other hands breaking through the rotted wood, smaller hands that belonged to children. The Hartwell family was clawing their way out of their mass grave, 60 years after their burial, driven by the desperate need for proper Christian burial. "What really happened to your family?" Mackenzie asked, kneeling beside the grave despite every instinct telling him to run. The sheriff's report mentioned ritual mutilation. Mary's skeletal face contorted with remembered pain. "It was the priest," she gasped between handfuls of dirt. "Father Donovan, who served here before you. He said he could cure our son of his fits, his strange behavior. But what he did to Tommy, what he did to all of us." Mackenzie's blood ran cold as understanding dawned. Father Donovan hadn't been trying to cure the boy. He'd been abusing him. And when the family had threatened to expose him, he'd killed them all and made it look like a wild animal attack. "Father Donovan told the townspeople we'd been practicing witchcraft," Mary continued, her voice growing stronger as more of her body emerged from the grave. "He said our deaths were God's judgment for consorting with demons. The community was so terrified they buried us in unhallowed ground and forbade anyone from speaking our names. Other figures were emerging now, a man who must have been Mary's husband, and 2 small children whose faces bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged suffering. They were all wrong, twisted by decades of supernatural existence, but their eyes held a desperate sanity that marked them as victims rather than monsters. "We need proper burial," Mary pleaded, reaching toward Mackenzie with hands that were more bone than flesh. "We need last rites, consecration, the prayers that will let our souls find peace. 60 years we've been howling in the darkness, trying to make someone hear us." Mackenzie looked into the woman's ruined face and saw the truth there. These weren't evil spirits. They were the restless dead, denied the basic dignity of Christian burial because of one corrupt priest's lies. Their howling hadn't been threats, it had been pleas for help. "I'll help you," Mackenzie said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "I'll give you the burial you should have received 60 years ago." But even as he spoke the words, he heard something that made his stomach clench with dread. The sound of footsteps approaching through the forest, and a voice he recognized from the old parish records calling out through the darkness, "You shouldn't have done that, Father Mackenzie. Some graves are meant to stay disturbed." Father Donovan stepped into the phosphorescent glow surrounding the grave, and Mackenzie's world tilted on its axis. The man should have been long dead. The parish records showed that he died in 1924, the year after the Hartwell murders. But here he stood, looking exactly as he had in the faded photograph hanging in the rectory hallway, wearing the same black cassock that was now stained with decades of grave dirt, and Father Donovan stepped into the phosphorescent glow surrounding the grave, and Mackenzie's world tilted on its axis. The man should have been long dead. The parish records showed that he died in 1924, the year after the Hartwell murders. But here he stood, looking exactly as he had in the faded photograph hanging in the rectory hallway, wearing the same black cassock that was now stained with decades of grave dirt and something darker. "You don't understand what you're interfering with," Donovan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "These souls were condemned for good reason. Their burial in unconsecrated ground was justice, not cruelty." Mary Hartwell hissed like an angry cat, her skeletal fingers clawing at the earth as she tried to pull herself completely free of the grave. "Liar, murderer! You killed us to hide your own sins," But Donovan only smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. Is that what you told yourself during all those years in the dark? That you were innocent victims? He turned to Mackenzie with mock sympathy. I'm afraid Mrs. Hartwell has been quite selective in her storytelling, Father. Shall I tell you what really happened in 1923? Mackenzie gripped his shovel tighter, though he wasn't sure whether he intended to use it as a weapon or a tool. The supernatural standoff in the cemetery felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, where one wrong move could send him tumbling into an abyss he'd never escape. The Hartwell family wasn't practicing witchcraft, Donovan continued, beginning to circle the grave like a predator stalking wounded prey. But they were guilty of something far worse. They were feeding on the children of this community, Father. Not metaphorically, literally. They were cannibals who had developed a taste for young flesh. Mary's protests grew more frantic, but Donovan's voice cut through her denials like a knife. I discovered the evidence in their cellar. Bones picked clean and arranged in ritualistic patterns. Personal belongings taken from missing children going back 5 years. And the Hartwell boy, little Tommy, he wasn't suffering from fits. He was going mad from the guilt of what his family was forcing him to participate in. Mackenzie felt sick as the implications sank in. If Donovan was telling the truth, then the Hartwell family hadn't been innocent victims at all. They'd been predators who had used their isolated cabin to lure and consume children from the surrounding area. You're lying, Mary shrieked, but her voice carried less conviction now. You killed us because Tommy was going to tell everyone what you did to him. What I did? Donovan laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Child, I tried to save your son's soul. When I realized what your family had been doing, I attempted an exorcism. I thought demonic possession was the only explanation for such depravity. The ghost priest's expression grew somber as he continued his tale. But it wasn't demons, Father Mackenzie. It was simple human evil, the kind that chooses to prey on the innocent because it enjoys causing pain. When I confronted them with the evidence, they attacked me. I was forced to defend myself. More figures were emerging from the disturbed grave now, the rest of the Hartwell family, including a young boy whose face bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged madness. As they climbed out of their earthen prison, Mackenzie could see that they weren't quite human anymore. 60 years of supernatural existence had changed them, sharpened their teeth, elongated their fingers into claws, given them the appearance of the monsters they had been in life. We were hungry, little Tommy Hartwell whispered, his voice carrying a note of innocent confusion that was somehow more horrifying than his mother's rage. Mama said the other children tasted like candy. She said God wanted us to eat them because we were special. Mackenzie's stomach churned as he realized the full scope of the horror. The Hartwell family had been serial killers who had cannibalized their victims, possibly teaching their children that consuming human flesh was not just acceptable, but divinely ordained. Father Donovan hadn't been a corrupt priest covering up abuse. He'd been a hero who had sacrificed his own life to stop monsters. But you're dead too, Mackenzie said to Donovan. The records show that you died the year after the Hartwells. Donovan nodded sadly. I died of guilt, Father. Guilt over the children I failed to save, over the families who never learned what happened to their missing loved ones. I took my own life, which is why I'm trapped here just as they are, all of us denied proper rest because of the violence that ended our lives. The Hartwell family was completely free of their grave now, standing in a loose circle around Mackenzie and Donovan. Their eyes glowed with unholy hunger, and Mackenzie realized with growing horror that 60 years of supernatural existence hadn't diminished their appetites. It had only made them stronger. Now you understand the choice before you, Donovan said quietly. You can give them the consecrated burial they demand, which will free them to hunt again among the living. Or you can help me return them to their unmarked grave, where they'll remain trapped but harmless. Mackenzie looked at the monstrous family surrounding him, then at the ghost of the priest who had died trying to stop them. The howling he'd heard hadn't been cries for help. It had been the frustrated rage of predators trapped in their own hunting ground. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," Mackenzie said firmly, raising his shovel like a weapon. Mary Hartwell smiled, revealing teeth that had grown into fangs during her decades underground. "Then you'll join us in the dark, Father. One way or another, we're leaving this grave tonight." The supernatural battle for St. Benedict's Cemetery was about to begin. Now get ready, let's start Story 8, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. Father Rodriguez knew something was wrong with the children's section of Mount Calvary Cemetery in Galveston the moment he saw the playground equipment. Swings that moved without wind, a merry-go-round that spun slowly on its own, and the soft sound of children's laughter echoing through the night when no living child was anywhere near the place. It was 2005, 3 years after Rodriguez had been assigned to the parish that oversaw the historic cemetery. Mount Calvary was over a century old, filled with the graves of Galveston's founding families and the victims of the Great Hurricane of 1900. But the children's section was different. It felt alive in a way that made his skin crawl and his rosary burn hot against his chest. The playground had been installed in the 1990s by a wealthy family who had lost their daughter to leukemia. They'd wanted to create a place where the spirits of dead children could find some semblance of the joy that had been stolen from them in life. What they'd actually created was something far more sinister, a supernatural magnet that drew the restless souls of children who had died violently or traumatically. Rodriguez first encountered them on a foggy October evening while conducting his monthly blessing of the cemetery grounds. As he approached the children's section, he heard the unmistakable sound of young voices laughing and playing. At first, he assumed it was neighborhood kids who had climbed the cemetery fence, but when he reached the playground, he found it empty, except for the equipment that continued to move on its own. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the thick fog. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Then, one by one, translucent figures began to materialize around the playground equipment. Children of various ages, all wearing clothes from different time periods, all bearing the unmistakable signs of violent death. A little girl in a Victorian dress sat on a swing, her neck bent at an unnatural angle. A boy in 1950s clothing stood by the slide, his chest caved in as if he'd been struck by a car. Near the merry-go-round, a group of children in more modern clothing huddled together, their bodies bearing the burns and cuts of the apartment fire that had claimed their lives. "Don't be afraid," the little girl said, her voice carrying despite her obviously broken neck. "We're not the scary ones, Father. We're the ones who got scared away from the light because we didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." Rodriguez felt his heart break as he looked at the assembled spirits. These weren't malevolent ghosts. They were lost children who had died before they were ready, their spirits clinging to the physical world because they couldn't accept the finality of death. "How long have you been here?" he asked gently, kneeling to bring himself closer to their eye level. "Time doesn't work the same for us," the boy by the slide replied. "Some of us have been here since the playground was built. Others just arrived. We keep hoping our families will come visit, will talk to us like they used to." The burned children stepped forward as a group, their spokesman a girl of perhaps 8 years old, whose clothes were charred but whose eyes held a terrible wisdom. "Our mama comes every week," she said. "She brings flowers and talks to our headstone, but she can't see us, can't hear us when we try to tell her we're okay." Rodriguez understood the tragedy of their situation. These children were trapped between worlds, unable to move on because their connections to the living were too strong, but also unable to truly interact with those they'd left behind. They existed in a liminal space of eternal childhood, playing endless games while their families grieved just beyond their reach. "Maybe I can help," Rodriguez said, though he wasn't sure what he could offer. "What do you need to find peace?" The Victorian girl stopped swinging and looked at him with eyes that held centuries of sorrow. "We need someone to tell our families that we're not suffering anymore. We need them to know that it's okay to stop visiting our graves every day, to stop crying for us. Their grief is keeping us anchored here." But even as she spoke, Rodriguez sensed something else in the children's section, a presence that wasn't as innocent as the lost spirits he'd been talking to. In the shadows beyond the playground, older shapes were moving. Figures that had once been children, but had been dead so long that their innocence had curdled into something darker. "You should leave now, Father," the burned girl whispered urgently. "The old ones are waking up, the children who've been dead so long they've forgotten what it was like to be alive. They don't like visitors." The temperature in the cemetery plummeted, and Rodriguez could see his breath forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. From the darkness beyond the playground came the sound of footsteps, not the light patter of children's feet, but heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to shake the ground with each impact. The footsteps grew closer, and Rodriguez could see them now. Children who had been dead for decades, their forms twisted by years of supernatural existence into something that barely resembled their original humanity. They moved with predatory grace, circling the playground like wolves surrounding prey. At their head was a boy who looked perhaps 12 years old, dressed in clothes from the early 1900s, but his eyes held the accumulated wisdom and cruelty of someone who had existed far beyond his apparent years. When he smiled, his teeth were sharp and yellowed, filed to points through decades of gnawing on things that should never be consumed. "Fresh priest," the boy said, his voice carrying harmonics that hurt Rodriguez's ears. "It's been so long since we had a fresh priest to play with." The last one lasted almost 3 weeks before he went completely mad. The innocent spirits Rodriguez had been speaking with began to fade, retreating to whatever sanctuary they could find among the playground equipment. The Victorian girl mouthed a single word before disappearing entirely: "Run!" But Rodriguez found himself unable to move. The ancient child spirits were exerting some kind of supernatural influence over his body, freezing his muscles in place while they closed in around him. He could only watch in growing horror as more of them emerged from the shadows, dozens of children who had died so long ago that their names had been erased from headstones, their families forgotten, their very existence wiped from human memory. "We were the first," the leader explained, circling Rodriguez with casual malice. "The first children to die in this place, back when it was nothing but swampland and fever dreams. Yellow fever took most of us, but some died from other things. Beatings, drowning, accidents that weren't really accidents. We've been here so long that we've forgotten our own names." Another child, a girl whose dress suggested she died sometime in the 1880s, stepped forward with a curtsy that was somehow obscene in its perfect execution. "We've watched this cemetery grow around us, Father, watched as newer dead were buried in our domain. And we've learned things during our long existence, terrible, wonderful things about pain and fear and the exquisite music that souls make when they're being torn apart." Rodriguez tried to speak, to pray, to call upon his faith for protection, but the words wouldn't come. The ancient spirits had paralyzed not just his body, but his voice, leaving him helpless as they continued their predatory stalking. "The new ones," the leader said, gesturing dismissively toward where the innocent spirits had vanished. "They still remember being human. They cling to their old emotions, their old connections. But we've moved beyond such limitations. We've learned to feed on fear and despair, to sustain ourselves on the terror of the living." The circle of ancient spirits grew tighter, and Rodriguez could smell them now, the stench of centuries of decay mixed with something sweet and cloying that made his stomach churn. They weren't just dead children. They'd become something far worse, creatures that had perverted their eternal childhood into an excuse for endless cruelty. "Every priest who's served this parish has eventually discovered us," the girl said, her voice taking on a sing-song quality that reminded Rodriguez of nursery rhymes. They come here thinking they can help the lost spirits, thinking their faith will protect them from harm. But faith is just another emotion we can feast upon, Father. The stronger your belief, the more delicious your terror will be when we finally break you. Rodriguez felt something brush against his mind. Cold, invasive thoughts that weren't his own probing at his consciousness. The ancient spirits were trying to get inside his head, to experience his fear from the inside out. Their centuries of existence had taught them that the most exquisite suffering came not from physical pain, but from psychological torment. "Tell us about your doubts, Father," the leader whispered, his breath cold against Rodriguez's ear. "Tell us about the times you've questioned God's plan, wondered why innocent children have to suffer and die. We can smell the guilt on you. All the times you failed to protect someone, all the prayers that went unanswered." Images began flooding Rodriguez's mind, memories of children from his previous parishes who had died despite his best efforts to help them. Kids who had succumbed to cancer, drowning victims he'd been too late to save, abuse cases where his intervention had come too late to prevent tragedy. The ancient spirits were feeding on these memories, growing stronger with each moment of remembered failure. "Yes," the girl hissed with satisfaction. "Feed us your guilt, your inadequacy, your human weakness. Show us every time you've wondered if God was really listening to your prayers." Oh, but even as Rodriguez felt his resolve beginning to crumble under the supernatural assault, he heard something that gave him hope. The faint sound of children's voices singing hymns. The innocent spirits hadn't abandoned him after all. They were fighting back in the only way they could, using their own lingering faith to counter the malevolence of the ancient ones. The hymns grew stronger, and Rodriguez felt the paralysis beginning to lift from his body. The innocent spirits were manifesting around the playground equipment again, but this time they weren't retreating. Led by the Victorian girl with the broken neck, they formed a protective circle around Rodriguez, their voices raised in songs they remembered from their brief lives. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," they sang, their young voices creating a harmony that seemed to push back against the darkness surrounding them. "That saved a wretch like me." The ancient spirits recoiled, as if struck by physical blows. The leader's predatory smile faltered, replaced by an expression of rage and something that might have been fear. "You cannot protect him," he snarled at the singing children. "We are older, stronger. We have fed on centuries of fear." But the innocent spirits continued singing, and Rodriguez realized what was happening. The hymns weren't just songs, they were prayers, expressions of faith that retained their power even after death. The ancient spirits had spent so long feeding on negative emotions that they had forgotten the simple strength of belief, the protective power of genuine innocence. Rodriguez found his voice returning and joined the hymn, his trained baritone blending with the ghostly children's chorus. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." The ancient spirits began to writhe in apparent agony, their forms becoming less solid as the sacred music washed over them. Centuries of accumulated malevolence were being burned away by the pure faith of children who had died but never lost their ability to believe in goodness. "This isn't over," the leader gasped, his form already beginning to fade. "We'll find another way, another priest to corrupt. You cannot guard this place forever." But the Victorian girl stepped forward, her neck straightening as the power of the hymn seemed to heal even her death wounds. "Yes, we can," she said firmly. "This is our playground, our sanctuary, and we won't let you hurt anyone else here." The ancient spirits made one final desperate assault, lunging toward Rodriguez with claws extended and teeth bared. But they passed right through him, their forms now too weakened by the hymns to affect the physical world. With screams of frustration that faded to whispers and then to silence, they dissolved completely, banished not by exorcism or holy water, but by the simple faith of innocent souls. As the last of the ancient spirits faded away, the temperature in the cemetery returned to normal. The playground equipment stopped its supernatural movement, becoming just ordinary swings and slides again. But the innocent spirits remained, no longer hiding in fear, but standing proudly around their sanctuary. "Thank you," Rodriguez said to the assembled children. "You saved my life." The burned girl smiled, her charred features somehow beautiful in the moonlight. "You helped us remember something important, Father. We don't have to be afraid of the old ones anymore. We don't have to hide from them or let them bully us just because they've been dead longer." "What will happen to them?" Rodriguez asked. "The ancient spirits, are they truly gone?" The Victorian girl considered this carefully. "They're gone from here, but they're not destroyed. They'll try to find another place to anchor themselves, another group of spirits to terrorize. That's why it's important that places like this exist, sanctuaries where the innocent dead can find protection and peace." Rodriguez spent the rest of the night talking with the children, learning their stories and understanding their needs. Some wanted messages delivered to still living relatives. Others simply needed someone to acknowledge their existence, to confirm that their brief lives had mattered. All of them had been trapped between worlds by the intensity of their connections to life, but now they seemed more at peace with their situation. As dawn approached, the spirits began to fade with the growing light. But before they disappeared completely, the Victorian girl approached Rodriguez one final time. "Will you come back?" she asked. "Will you visit us again?" "Of course," Rodriguez promised. "This is your home and you're part of my parish now. I'll make sure you're never alone again." The girl smiled and curtsied one last time before fading away with the sunrise. But Rodriguez could still hear the echo of children's laughter drifting across the cemetery, joyful now instead of mournful. From that day forward, Mount Calvary's children's section became a different kind of place. Parents who had lost children began reporting strange comforts, the feeling of small hands patting their shoulders while they grieved, the sound of familiar laughter that helped them remember joy instead of just sorrow. The innocent spirits had found their purpose, becoming guardians and comforters rather than lost souls wandering in darkness. And sometimes on quiet Sunday mornings, when the fog rolled in from the Gulf, visitors could hear the children singing hymns in the distance, a ghostly choir that reminded everyone who heard it that death was not the end of love or faith, or the simple joy of being young and innocent in a complicated world. The playground equipment never moved on its own again, but sometimes the swings would creak gently in still air, as if pushed by invisible hands that remembered what it felt like to fly. Now get ready, let's start story 9. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father Castellanos should have left the key where he found it, embedded in the altar stone of St. Joseph's Cathedral in New Orleans, like a splinter in the heart of the church itself. But curiosity, that fatal flaw that had driven humanity to taste forbidden fruit, compelled him to pry it free with trembling fingers, setting in motion events that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was April 1993, and Castellanos had been assigned to oversee the restoration of the abandoned cathedral. St. Joseph's had been closed for over a decade, its congregation scattered after a scandal involving the previous pastor. The building had fallen into serious disrepair, its foundations rotting, its walls blackened by time and neglect. The bishop wanted to either restore it to its former glory or demolish it entirely, and Castellanos was tasked with determining which option was feasible. The key was unlike anything he'd ever seen, ancient iron worked into intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the light, as if the metal itself was alive and moving. It shouldn't have been there, embedded in stone that had been quarried and carved over a century ago. Yet there it was, jutting from the altar like a dagger thrust into the heart of the sanctuary. The moment Castellanos touched the key, the cathedral changed around him. The air grew thick and oppressive, pressing against his lungs like invisible hands. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, and his breath began coming out in visible puffs. Most unsettling of all, he could hear whispers echoing through the empty nave. Dozens of voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, their words layered over each other until they formed a cacophony of desperate pleading. That night, alone in the rectory beside the cathedral, Castellanos was awakened by the sound of his own name being called, not shouted or whispered, but spoken with calm authority, as if someone was standing beside his bed issuing a command. When he opened his eyes, he was alone, but clutched in his right hand was the iron key, though he had no memory of picking it up. "Father Castellanos," the voice said again, and this time he could tell it was coming from the direction of the cathedral. "You've opened the way." Against every instinct screaming at him to stay in the rectory, Castellanos dressed and walked to the cathedral. The heavy wooden doors, which he had locked securely before retiring, stood wide open. Beyond them, the nave was filled with an unnatural blue light that seemed to emanate from the floor itself. The cathedral's interior had changed. Where once there had been rows of pews, now there were only empty spaces marked by strange symbols carved into the floor. The symbols glowed with the same blue light, forming intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the center of the nave, where the altar should have been, was a stone staircase descending into darkness. "The crypts," Castellanos whispered, though he knew that St. Joseph's had never had underground burial chambers. The building's foundation sat directly on New Orleans' notorious swampland, where the water table made underground construction impossible. Yet the stairs were undeniably real, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. Each step was marked with more of the strange symbols, and as Castellanos descended, he could feel the key in his hand growing warm, then hot, then burning like a coal against his palm. The staircase led to a circular chamber that defied the laws of physics. It was vast, far larger than the cathedral above could possibly contain, and lined with iron gates that stretched up into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. Behind each gate, Castellanos could see movement, shapes that might once have been human, but had been twisted by centuries of supernatural imprisonment. "Welcome, Father," said a voice from the central gate. The speaker was tall and gaunt, dressed in the rotted remains of clerical robes. His face was aristocratic but wrong, the features too sharp, the eyes too knowing, the smile revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "I am Bishop Maldred, and I have been waiting for someone to bring me the key." Castellanos tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't obey. The key in his hand was burning now, the metal searing his flesh, but he couldn't release it. Something about the chamber was compelling him forward, toward the central gate where Bishop Maldred waited with patient malevolence. "You don't understand what you've done," the bishop continued, his voice carrying harmonics that made Castellanos' teeth ache. "That key doesn't just open doors, Father. It opens barriers. The barriers between worlds, between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the profane." Behind the other gates, more figures were pressing forward. Dozens of corrupt clergy from throughout history, all of them bearing the marks of their particular sins. Murderous priests, pedophile bishops, nuns who had sold their souls for temporal power. All of them had been imprisoned in this supernatural dungeon, waiting for someone to release them back into the world. "Who imprisoned you?" Castellanos asked, his voice barely a whisper. Bishop Maldred's smile widened. "God himself, Father. When we died with mortal sin on our souls, he created this place as our purgatory. But purgatory was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to be a way station on the path to either heaven or hell. We've been trapped here for centuries, growing stronger, growing hungrier, waiting for the day when someone would finally set us free. Each of us has a story," Bishop Maldred said, gesturing toward the other imprisoned figures. "Each of us fell from grace in our own spectacular way. Would you like to hear our confessions, Father? Would you like to know what sins are so terrible that even death cannot cleanse them?" Castellanos wanted to refuse, wanted to turn and run back up those impossible stairs, but the key in his hand was exerting its own will now. It was pulling him toward the gates, toward the bishop who waited with such terrible patience. Against his conscious will, Castellanos found himself nodding. Father Benedict there, Maldred pointed to a monk whose cassock was stained with old blood, murdered 12 children in his monastery's orphanage. He told their families they had died of plague, but actually he'd been feeding their flesh to demons in exchange for forbidden knowledge. The monk pressed his face against the iron bars, his eyes glowing with unnatural light. "The knowledge was worth it," he whispered. "I learned the true names of angels, the secret words that can unmake creation itself. When I'm free, I'll teach those words to others, spread that beautiful destruction across the world." "And Sister Agatha," Maldred continued, indicating a nun whose face had been carved with blasphemous symbols. "She convinced her entire convent that God wanted them to sacrifice babies to ensure good harvests. 17 infants died before the church authorities discovered what she was doing." Miss Sister Agatha laughed, a sound like nails on slate. "The crops were magnificent that year. The villagers ate so well, grew so fat and happy. They should have thanked me for my innovation, my willingness to do what was necessary for their prosperity." One by one, Bishop Maldred introduced the imprisoned clergy, each confession more horrific than the last. Priests who had founded suicide cults, bishops who had sold relics made from their victims' bones, nuns who had practiced black magic in the very sanctuaries they were supposed to protect. All of them had used their positions of religious authority to commit acts so evil that they had been cast into this supernatural prison upon their deaths. "But you're the key bearer now," Maldred said, his attention returning to Castellanos. "The one chosen to release us back into the world. The question is, will you do so willingly, or must we take more persuasive measures?" Castellanos felt the key burning hotter in his palm, the metal now hot enough to sear his flesh. But with the pain came clarity, understanding of what was really happening. "You can't escape without my consent," he realized. "That's why you need the key. It represents free will, choice. You can't break out of this prison unless someone chooses to release you." Bishop Maldred's smile flickered for just a moment. "Very perceptive, Father. Yes. The locks on our cells require willing participation from someone who still has a clean soul. God's final cruel joke. We can only escape through the cooperation of someone we cannot corrupt." "Then my answer is no," Castellanos said firmly, trying to ignore the agony in his hand as the key continued to burn. "I won't release you. I won't unleash your evil on the world again." The temperature in the chamber plummeted, and the imprisoned clergy began to howl with frustrated rage. They pressed against their bars, reaching through the gaps with clawed hands, their faces contorting into masks of pure hatred. "You don't have a choice!" Bishop Maldred roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls with supernatural force. "The key will consume you, burn through your flesh and bones, until you have no choice but to use it. You'll open our gates just to make the pain stop." And the bishop was right. The key was burning through Castellanos' palm now, the metal actually melting his flesh. The pain was beyond anything he'd ever experienced, a white-hot agony that seemed to reach directly into his nervous system and set every nerve ending on fire. But even as the pain threatened to drive him mad, Castellanos remembered something crucial from his seminary training. The supernatural couldn't truly force human will. It could influence, coerce, tempt, and torment, but the final choice always remained with the individual, and he chose to resist. "I accept the pain," Castellanos gasped through gritted teeth. "I accept it as penance for my curiosity, for my failure to leave well enough alone, but I will not release you." The key flared with such intense heat that Castellanos expected to see his hand reduced to ash. But instead of destroying him, the metal began to cool, its surface returning to normal temperature. The blue light in the chamber dimmed, and the howls of the imprisoned clergy faded to disappointed murmurs. "Impossible," Bishop Maldred whispered. "No one has ever resisted the key's compulsion before." "Then no one has ever truly chosen to serve God over themselves," Castellanos replied, finally able to unclench his burned hand. The key remained in his palm, but now it felt different, Not like a weapon or a tool of corruption, but like a responsibility he would have to bear for the rest of his life. "You don't understand what you've done," Bishop Maldred said, his voice now carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "By resisting the key's compulsion, you've become its permanent guardian. You're bound to this place now, Father, bound to watch over us for the rest of your natural life." Castellanos felt the truth of those words settling into his bones like a cold weight. The chamber around him was no longer just a supernatural prison. It was his responsibility, his burden to bear. Every day for the rest of his life, he would have to ensure that these corrupt souls remained contained, never again allowed to spread their evil in the world above. "How many others?" Castellanos asked. "How many other key bearers have there been?" "Dozens," Bishop Maldred replied. "Over the centuries, dozens of priests, monks, and nuns have found keys like yours embedded in altars, hidden in reliquaries, or buried beneath church foundations. Most of them gave in to our persuasions eventually, but a very few, chose to become guardians instead." The bishop gestured toward a corner of the chamber where Castellanos could now see additional figures, not imprisoned behind bars, but standing free in small alcoves carved into the walls. They wore the same expression of weary determination that Castellanos could feel settling over his own features. "Father Torino guarded us for 43 years before age finally claimed him," Maldred said. "Sister Marguerite lasted 37 years. Brother Francisco made it to 68 years of faithful service before his heart gave out. They all rest here now, their souls clean despite the terrible knowledge they carried." Castellanos approached one of the alcoves, where an elderly priest stood in eternal vigil. The man's eyes were closed, but his lips moved in constant silent prayer. Around his neck hung a key, identical to the one now burning in Castellanos's palm. "They're not dead," Castellanos realized. "Their bodies died, but their souls chose to remain here as guardians. The ultimate sacrifice," Maldred confirmed, "to give up not just life, but the promise of eternal rest, in order to keep evil contained. It's almost admirable in its futility." But Castellanos wasn't listening to the bishop anymore. He was studying the guardian spirits, trying to understand the choice they had made. They had chosen duty over comfort, responsibility over reward, eternal vigilance over eternal peace. It was the most Christ-like decision possible, to sacrifice oneself for the protection of others. "I accept," Castellanos said quietly. "I accept the responsibility of guardianship." The moment he spoke those words, the chamber changed around him. The iron bars grew thicker, more complex, their locks becoming intricate puzzles that would require not just the key, but genuine understanding to solve. The symbols on the floor rearranged themselves, forming new patterns that strengthened the containment field around the imprisoned clergy. Bishop Maldred stepped back from his gate with something that might have been disappointment. "Another generation of guardianship begins," he said. "Another lifetime of waiting." "Tell me about the other keys," Castellanos said, settling into his new role with grim determination. "How many more are there? How many other places like this exist?" "Hundreds," Maldred replied, "scattered across the globe, hidden in holy places where corrupt clergy were laid to rest. Each key opens a different chamber. Each chamber contains different sins. Murder, betrayal, heresy, blasphemy, all the ways that those who should have served God chose to serve themselves instead." Castellanos nodded, filing that information away for future consideration. If he survived long enough to pass on his guardianship, he would need to leave detailed records for whoever came after him. The knowledge couldn't be allowed to die with him. The years that followed were difficult in ways. Castellanos had never imagined. Days were spent maintaining the cathedral above, conducting normal priestly duties while carrying the terrible secret of what lay beneath. Nights were spent in the chamber, walking among the iron gates, listening to the whispered temptations and threats of the imprisoned clergy. They never stopped trying to corrupt him. Bishop Maldred was particularly persistent, offering knowledge of future events, the location of hidden treasures, even the power to perform miraculous healings in exchange for just one moment of weakness, one use of the key to open just one gate. "Think of the good you could do," Maldred would whisper during the darkest hours of Castellanos's vigil. Father Benedict's knowledge could cure diseases that medical science hasn't even discovered yet. Sister Agatha's agricultural secrets could end world hunger. All you have to do is let one of us out for just a few hours. But Castellanos had learned to recognize the lies beneath the tempting offers. These souls had been imprisoned for good reason. Their corruption was so complete that even their apparent virtues were poisoned. Any knowledge they shared would come with a price that far exceeded its benefits. The most difficult part wasn't resisting their temptations, though. It was the isolation. Castellanos couldn't tell anyone about his burden, couldn't share the weight of guardianship with another living soul. He aged rapidly under the stress, his hair turning gray within 5 years, his face becoming gaunt and lined with premature wrinkles. Sometimes, late at night, he would speak with the guardian spirits for comfort. They couldn't respond. Their eternal vigil required complete focus, but their presence reminded him that others had walked this path before him and found the strength to endure. After 23 years of guardianship, Castellanos began to feel his body failing. The constant exposure to supernatural evil was taking its toll, wearing away at his physical form like acid eating through metal. He knew his time was running short, and he began preparing for the day when someone else would have to take his place. He wrote detailed journals, hiding them throughout the cathedral in places where a future guardian might find them. He documented every temptation the imprisoned clergy had offered, every lie they had told, every weakness they had tried to exploit. Most importantly, he recorded the locations of other keys that Bishop Maldred had revealed during unguarded moments. When the end came, it was peaceful. Castellanos simply knelt in prayer one night and never rose again. His body was discovered the next morning by the cathedral's groundskeeper, who assumed the elderly priest had died of natural causes during his evening devotions. But Castellanos' spirit remained, taking its place among the other guardians in their eternal vigil. The key passed to the next priest assigned to St. Joseph's, a young man named Father Morrison, who would discover it embedded in the altar stone just as Castellanos had 30 years before. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. For some sins are so terrible that they require eternal vigilance, and some sacrifices are so necessary that they must be made again and again across the generations. In the chamber beneath St. Joseph's Cathedral, Bishop Maldred smiled as he heard new footsteps on the stone stairs. Another key-bearer approached. Another choice would be made. And if this one chose guardianship as his predecessors had, Maldred could wait. After all, he had eternity. Now get ready. Let's start story 10. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you, because now you're going to die of fear. Father Sullivan had heard thousands of confessions during his 30 years as a priest, but none had prepared him for the voice that came through the screen at exactly midnight on December 13th, 1998. It wasn't the content of the confession that chilled him. It was the fact that the confessional booth had been empty when the voice began to speak. St. Michael's Cathedral in Chicago had been Sullivan's assignment for the past decade. The church was old, built in 1847, with a confessional booth that had been hand-carved by German craftsmen using oak from trees that had stood for centuries before being felled for sacred purposes. The booth was beautiful, its dark wood polished to a mirror shine, its interior lined with purple velvet that muffled sound and created an atmosphere of intimate secrecy. But something had changed about the confessional in recent weeks. Parishioners complained that sitting inside it made them uncomfortable, that they felt compelled to reveal sins they had never intended to confess. Mrs. Patterson had admitted to embezzling from her husband's business. Mr. Chen had confessed to an affair that had ended 20 years ago. Even children seemed affected. 8-year-old Tommy Morrison had sobbed while admitting that he'd been stealing money from his mother's purse. Sullivan had initially attributed the unusual confessions to the approaching Christmas season. People often felt moved to cleanse their souls before celebrating Christ's birth, but the pattern was too consistent, too intense to be explained by seasonal devotion alone. The midnight confession began without any of the usual preliminaries. Sullivan had been preparing to leave the church when he heard movement in the confessional, followed by the sound of someone settling into the penitent's side of the booth. Assuming it was a parishioner in urgent need of spiritual guidance, Sullivan had entered the priest's side and waited for the traditional opening. Instead, a voice that seemed to come from very far away spoke directly. "I have been waiting for you, Father Sullivan." "No, how do you know my name?" Sullivan asked, peering through the carved screen that separated him from the penitent. The other side of the booth appeared empty, lit only by the single candle that burned continuously in the sanctuary. "I know all their names," the voice replied. "Father McKenna, who served here from 1847 to 1863. Father O'Malley, who lasted from 1863 to 1889. Father Kowalski, 1889 to 1924. Shall I continue, or would you prefer to hear why they all left this place in terror?" Sullivan's blood ran cold. The voice was listing the actual succession of priests who had served St. Michael's, information that wasn't readily available to the general public. Church records from the 19th century were fragmentary at best, stored in archives that few people ever accessed. "Who are you?" Sullivan whispered. "I am the confessor who never received absolution," the voice replied. "The penitent who died before completing the sacrament. I have been trapped in this booth for 151 years, listening to the sins of others while unable to confess my own." The temperature in the confessional plummeted. Sullivan's breath began coming out in visible puffs, and frost formed on the carved wooden screen between him and the apparently empty penitent's side. The candle in the sanctuary flickered wildly, as if buffeted by invisible winds. "Tell me your sin," Sullivan said, his training overriding his fear. "Tell me what keeps you bound to this place." "Murder," the voice whispered, and now Sullivan could see something taking shape on the other side of the screen. A translucent figure in clothing from the mid-1800s, its hands pressed together in prayer. "I murdered Father McKenna, the first priest to serve this parish. I came to confess my crime, but he recognized me before I could speak. In my panic, I strangled him with my own rosary." Sullivan's hands trembled as he gripped his own rosary. "What was your original sin, the one you came to confess?" The figure became more solid, its features becoming visible through the screen. It was a man of perhaps 40, with the gaunt look of someone who had lived a hard life. His eyes held a desperate sanity that was somehow more terrifying than madness would have been. "I had been killing children," the man said with terrible calmness. "For 7 years, I had been taking children from the streets of Chicago, bringing them to my warehouse and using them for my pleasure before disposing of their bodies in the river." Sullivan fought down a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a lost soul seeking redemption. This was one of history's monsters, a predator who had used the confessional as his final hunting ground. "I came to confess because I knew I was dying," the spirit continued. "Consumption was eating away at my lungs, and I wanted to clear my soul before meeting my maker. But when Father McKenna saw my face, he knew who I was. The police had been searching for me for months. Father McKenna tried to leave the booth, tried to call for help," the spirit continued, its form becoming more solid with each word. "But I couldn't let him expose me. Not when I was so close to receiving absolution for my crimes. So I reached through the screen and wrapped my rosary around his neck." Sullivan could see it happening as the ghost described it. The priest's shocked recognition, the desperate struggle in the confined space of the confessional, the gradual tightening of the rosary beads around Father McKenna's throat. The booth had been designed to protect the secrecy of confession, but that same privacy had made it the perfect place for murder. He fought, the spirit said, with something that might have been admiration. Clawed at the rosary, tried to break free, but I was stronger and I was desperate. I held on until he stopped moving, until his body went limp against the kneeler. "And then?" Sullivan asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Then I tried to complete my confession to his corpse," the spirit replied. "I thought perhaps God would still hear me, would still grant me absolution even though the priest was dead. But the moment I began to speak my sins aloud, I felt a terrible pain in my chest. The consumption claimed me right there in the booth, and I died before I could finish confessing." Sullivan understood the horrible irony of the situation. The murderer had been so close to the absolution he craved, but his final crime had damned him to an eternity of waiting. He was trapped in the confessional, bound to the scene of his last sin, unable to move on until someone heard his complete confession and granted him the forgiveness he sought. "Every priest who has served this parish has eventually discovered me," the spirit continued. "I appear to them at midnight, when the boundary between worlds is thinnest. I try to confess, but something always goes wrong. Father O'Malley fled before I could finish. Father Kowalski tried to perform an exorcism instead of hearing my confession. None of them understood what I really needed." "What do you need?" Sullivan asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Complete absolution," the spirit replied. "I need someone to hear my full confession, not just the murder of Father McKenna, but all of it. Every child I killed, every moment of suffering I caused, every sin I committed during my 7 years of hunting. Only then can I find peace." Sullivan felt the weight of an impossible choice settling on his shoulders. The church taught that all souls deserved the chance at redemption, that no sin was too great for God's forgiveness. But this spirit wasn't seeking forgiveness out of genuine remorse. It was seeking escape from the consequences of its actions. "Tell me about the children," Sullivan said, steeling himself for what was to come. "Tell me their names." The spirit's eyes lit up with eager anticipation. "Mary O'Brien, age 7. I took her from the docks while her mother was working. She cried for 3 days before I silenced her permanently." Each name was a knife through Sullivan's heart. The spirit described the children with clinical detachment, recounting their suffering as if discussing the weather. There was no remorse in its voice, no genuine sorrow for the lives it had destroyed. This was confession as transaction, an attempt to purchase salvation through the mere act of speaking sins aloud. Thomas Chen, age 9. He fought harder than the others, left scratches on my arms that took weeks to heal. I kept him alive longer as punishment for his resistance. Sullivan realized that the other side of the confessional was changing as the spirit spoke. The purple velvet lining was darkening, becoming stained with something that looked suspiciously like old blood. The carved wooden screen was warping, its intricate patterns shifting to form the twisted faces of suffering children. "Sarah McKenna, age 6. "McKenna?" Sullivan interrupted. "Related to Father McKenna?" The spirit's smile was horrible to behold. "His niece. I took her specifically because I knew it would hurt him. I wanted him to understand the pain of loss before I confessed my crimes to him. But he recognized me too quickly, before I could explain the exquisite care I had taken with his precious Sarah." Sullivan felt sick. This creature hadn't just been a random killer, it had been a calculating predator who had targeted the priest's own family as part of some twisted game. Its confession wasn't about seeking forgiveness, it was about reliving its crimes, savoring the details of each atrocity. "I won't absolve you," Sullivan said firmly. "You're not truly repentant. You take pleasure in describing what you did to those children." The spirit's expression darkened. "You cannot refuse me the sacrament, priest. Your own doctrine demands that you offer forgiveness to any who seek it." "Only to those who are genuinely sorry for their sins," Sullivan replied. "You're not sorry. You're proud. You want absolution not because you found God, but because you want to escape the punishment you've earned. The confessional booth began to shake violently, its wooden frame creaking and groaning as supernatural energy poured through it. The spirit's form was becoming more solid, more real, as its anger grew. The temperature continued to drop until Sullivan's breath came out in thick clouds of vapor. "You don't understand," the spirit snarled, its voice taking on harmonics that hurt Sullivan's ears. "I have been trapped in this booth for over a century, reliving my death every single night. The pain in my chest, the inability to breathe, the terror of facing judgment with unconfessed sins on my soul. I experience it all, again and again." Sullivan gripped his rosary tighter, the blessed silver growing warm against his palm. "Good," he said firmly. "You deserve every moment of that suffering. You deserve an eternity of pain for what you did to those innocent children." The spirit lunged forward, its hands passing through the wooden screen as if it were made of mist. Translucent fingers closed around Sullivan's throat, and he could feel the same pressure that had killed Father McKenna over a century ago. "Then you'll share my fate," the spirit hissed. "If I cannot have absolution, I'll drag you into this booth with me. You'll experience my death over and over again, just as I have. You'll understand what it's like to die with unconfessed sins burning in your soul." But as the ghostly hands tightened around his neck, Sullivan did something the spirit didn't expect. Instead of fighting or trying to escape, he began to pray, not for himself, but for the children the spirit had murdered. "Lord, grant peace to Mary O'Brien," Sullivan gasped through his constricted throat. "Let her innocent soul find the rest that was stolen from her in life." The spirit's grip loosened slightly, confusion replacing anger in its translucent features. "Grant peace to Thomas Chen," Sullivan continued. "Let his suffering end. Let his spirit find the joy that was taken from him." "Stop," the spirit whispered, its voice no longer filled with malice, but with something that might have been fear. "You're not supposed to pray for them. You're supposed to pray for me, to grant me the absolution I need." But Sullivan kept praying, naming each child the spirit had described, asking God to grant them the peace their murderer would never find. With each prayer, the spirit became less solid, less real, as if the act of honoring its victims was somehow diminishing its power. "Grant peace to Sarah McKenna," Sullivan said, and the spirit screamed, not in anger, but in genuine anguish. "Let her uncle's grief be replaced by the knowledge that she is safe in God's arms." The confessional booth began to change around them. The blood-stained velvet was lightening, returning to its original purple. The twisted faces in the wooden screen were smoothing out, becoming simple decorative patterns again. Most importantly, the oppressive presence that had haunted the booth for over a century was fading. "You can't do this," the spirit gasped, its form now barely visible. "I need confession, I need absolution, You need to face judgment," Sullivan interrupted. "You need to account for your crimes without the protection of sacramental forgiveness. That's what you've been running from all these years. Not hell, but justice." The spirit made one final desperate lunge toward Sullivan, but its hands passed harmlessly through him. The confessional booth gave a final shudder, then fell silent. The temperature returned to normal, and the candle in the sanctuary stopped flickering. Sullivan sat in the sudden quiet for several minutes, listening to his own heartbeat gradually return to normal. When he finally emerged from the confessional, he found something that made him smile despite everything he'd been through. A small bouquet of flowers had appeared on the altar, placed there by invisible hands as a thank you from the children whose souls had finally been acknowledged. From that night forward, the confessional booth at St. Michael's returned to normal. Parishioners no longer felt compelled to reveal sins they'd never intended to confess. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted the church for over a century lifted completely. But Sullivan kept the story to himself, recording it only in his private journal. Some truths were too terrible to share, and some victories too small to celebrate publicly. He had saved the souls of innocent children by denying absolution to their killer, a choice that violated every rule he'd been taught about the sacrament of confession, but felt absolutely right in his heart. Years later, when Sullivan was transferred to another parish, he left detailed notes for his successor about the church's history. Hidden among routine maintenance records and budget reports was a simple warning. Some confessions should never be heard. Some souls don't deserve forgiveness. Trust your instincts over your training. The confessional booth remained empty at midnight from that day forward, finally free of the evil that had haunted it for so long. Now get ready, let's start story 11. And if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father Anderson discovered the first bone on a Tuesday morning in November 1989, placed carefully on the front steps of St. Peter's Cemetery office in Baltimore like an offering to some forgotten god. It was a human femur, polished to an ivory shine, with strange symbols carved into its surface that seemed to shift and move when viewed from different angles. Anderson had been working as the cemetery's caretaker for 6 months, a position he'd taken after his nervous breakdown in Detroit. The bishop had thought that quiet work among the dead might help him recover from what the church delicately termed spiritual exhaustion. What they really meant was that Anderson had lost his faith after watching too many children die from cancer in the pediatric ward where he'd served as chaplain. The cemetery was peaceful, exactly what Anderson needed for his recovery. During the day, he tended to the grounds, maintained the grave markers, and occasionally performed funeral services for families who couldn't afford a proper priest. At night, he retreated to the small caretaker's cottage and tried to rebuild his relationship with a God who seemed to have abandoned the innocent. But the bone changed everything. Anderson knew enough anatomy from his hospital work to recognize it as human, and the craftsmanship of the carving suggested someone with considerable skill and knowledge. The symbols weren't random scratches. They were deliberate markings that formed patterns too complex to be coincidental. Anderson's first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped him. The bone hadn't been dumped or discarded. It had been placed with careful precision, positioned so that it would be the first thing he saw when opening the office that morning. Someone wanted him to find it, wanted him to see it. But why? The second bone appeared 3 days later, this time placed on the altar of the small chapel that served the cemetery. It was a radius bone from a human arm, carved with the same strange symbols, but arranged in a different pattern. Anderson noticed that when placed next to the first bone, the symbols seemed to complement each other, forming larger designs that hurt to look at directly. By the end of the week, Anderson had collected 7 human bones, each one expertly carved, each one positioned where he couldn't miss it. They appeared on his doorstep, beside grave markers, even floating in the small pond at the cemetery's center. Whoever was leaving them had unlimited access to the grounds and seemed to know Anderson's daily routine perfectly. The bones were beautiful in their own grotesque way. The carving was exquisite, transforming what should have been grisly remnants into works of art. But there was something wrong about them, something that made Anderson's skin crawl whenever he handled them. They were always warm to the touch, regardless of the weather, and sometimes he swore he could hear faint whispers coming from within the carved symbols. Anderson tried to research the markings, spending his evenings in the diocesan library, looking through books on archaeology, anthropology, and religious iconography. What he found chilled him to the bone, literally. The symbols were ancient, predating Christianity by thousands of years. They appeared in cave paintings, on Neolithic monuments, carved into the walls of underground burial chambers across Europe and Asia. But most disturbing was their purpose. According to the fragmentary sources Anderson could find, the symbols were part of a binding ritual, a way to trap souls within physical objects, preventing them from moving on to whatever afterlife awaited them. The bones weren't just carved, they were prisons, containing the spirits of whoever they had originally belonged to. On the 10th night, Anderson heard the whispers clearly for the first time. He was cataloguing the bones in his cottage, trying to determine if there was a pattern to their placement, when voices began drifting from the carved symbols. Dozens of voices, all speaking at once, all pleading for release. "Free us," they whispered. "Break the bonds. Let us rest." Anderson dropped the bone he'd been examining, his hands shaking as the voices grew louder, more desperate. The cottage filled with the sound of supernatural suffering, souls trapped for God knew how long, unable to find peace because of the binding symbols carved into their earthly remains. "Who did this to you?" Anderson asked, though he felt foolish speaking to carved bones. "The Collector," came the unified response. "The one who gathers the forgotten dead, who steals souls to build his army of servants." Anderson looked around his cottage, suddenly aware that he had been collecting the bones exactly as someone had intended. 17 human bones, all carved with binding symbols, all containing trapped souls. He had been gathering them carefully, keeping them safe, playing right into someone's hands. That's when he heard the footsteps outside his cottage. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to shake the ground with each impact. Someone was approaching. Someone who had been waiting for Anderson to gather all the bones in one place. The footsteps stopped directly outside Anderson's front door, followed by 3 slow, deliberate knocks that seemed to echo through the cottage like thunder. Anderson clutched his rosary, the blessed silver burning hot against his palm, as he approached the door with trembling steps. Standing on his threshold was a tall, gaunt figure, dressed in the rotted remains of what might once have been clerical robes. The man's face was aristocratic but wrong, too pale, too angular, with eyes that held depths of knowledge no human should possess. Most disturbing of all, he was solid, real, clearly alive despite the aura of death that surrounded him. "Father Anderson," the figure said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the bones on Anderson's table rattle in response. "I see you've been taking good care of my collection. I do so appreciate careful custodianship." "Who are you?" Anderson asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Brother Mordecai," the figure replied with a bow that was somehow obscene in its perfect execution. "Once of the Benedictine order before I discovered more productive pursuits. I've been collecting souls for 3 centuries now, perfecting the art of binding spirits to physical objects." Anderson backed away from the door, but Brother Mordecai had already stepped inside, uninvited. The cottage seemed to grow smaller around him, the walls pressing inward as his presence filled the space with supernatural malevolence. "Why?" Anderson whispered. "Why trap souls? Why prevent them from finding peace?" Brother Mordecai smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Because death is inefficient, Father. When people die, their knowledge dies with them, their skills, their memories, their unique perspectives, all lost forever. But if you bind their souls to physical objects, you can access that knowledge whenever you need it." The carved bones on Anderson's table began to glow with sickly light, the symbols pulsing in rhythm with Brother Mordecai's heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as the trapped souls sensed their captor's presence. "Each bone contains someone special," Brother Mordecai continued, approaching the table with obvious pride. "This femur belonged to Dr. Margaret Chen, a surgeon who discovered a new technique for treating brain tumors before I recruited her. This radius came from Professor Williams, a linguist who could speak 17 languages fluently." Anderson realized with growing horror that Brother Mordecai wasn't just collecting random souls. He was targeting specific individuals, people whose knowledge and skills he wanted to preserve for his own use. The carved symbols weren't just prisons. They were libraries, storing human consciousness like books on a shelf. "And you, Father Anderson," Brother Mordecai said, his attention turning back to the terrified priest. "You have exactly the kind of soul I've been looking for. Someone who has lost his faith, who questions God's plan, who has seen enough suffering to understand that divine mercy is a lie. "I won't help you," Anderson said, backing against the cottage wall. "I won't let you add my soul to your collection." Brother Mordecai laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with children's screams. "You already have helped me, by gathering the bones, by keeping them safe, by listening to their whispers. You've strengthened the binding ritual, made it easier for me to access their knowledge, and now it's time for the final step." The monk reached into his robes and withdrew a bone-carving knife, its blade black with old blood and strange symbols. "The ritual requires a willing sacrifice, someone who offers their soul freely in exchange for a promise of purpose. I can offer you something your God never could, Father. I can guarantee that your death will mean something." Anderson looked at the knife, then at the glowing bones on his table. The trapped souls were still whispering, still pleading for release. 17 brilliant minds reduced to supernatural prisoners, their knowledge harvested like crops by a madman who saw human consciousness as a resource to be exploited. "What purpose?" Anderson asked, playing for time while his mind raced for some way to escape. "You'll become my latest acquisition," Brother Mordecai explained. "Your experience with death, your intimate knowledge of grief and loss, your crisis of faith, all of it will be preserved forever. I'll be able to access your memories whenever I need to understand human suffering, to perfect my techniques for breaking down spiritual resistance." The monk stepped closer, the knife gleaming in the supernatural light emanating from the bones. "Think of it, Father. Instead of dying forgotten in some hospital bed, your consciousness will survive for centuries. You'll be part of something greater than yourself, a collection of humanity's finest minds working together for a common purpose." "What purpose?" Anderson repeated, his back now pressed against the cottage wall. Brother Mordecai's smile widened, revealing more of those filed teeth. "The resurrection of the dead, of course. With enough trapped souls, enough accumulated knowledge, I'll be able to find the secret of bringing back the departed. Not as zombies or ghosts, but as living, breathing beings with all their memories intact." Anderson felt his blood turn to ice as the full scope of Brother Mordecai's plan became clear. The monk wasn't just collecting souls out of madness or greed. He was trying to conquer death itself, to become a god who could grant eternal life to whomever he chose. "You're insane," Anderson whispered, staring at the bone knife in Brother Mordecai's hands. "Death isn't meant to be conquered. It's part of God's plan, part of the natural order." Brother Mordecai's expression darkened. "God's plan? Where was God's plan when children died of cancer in your hospital ward, Father? Where was divine mercy when innocent souls suffered and died while you watched helplessly? I offer something better than faith. I offer proof that death can be defeated." The carved bones on the table pulsed brighter, and Anderson could feel the trapped soul's desperation growing stronger. They had been listening to this conversation for who knew how long, hearing Brother Mordecai's promises of resurrection while remaining trapped in their bony prisons. "Tell me about them," Anderson said, gesturing toward the bones. "Tell me about the people you murdered for your collection." "Murdered?" Brother Mordecai seemed genuinely offended. "I prefer the term recruited. Each of them was offered the same choice I'm offering you: eternal preservation in exchange for temporary death. Most of them accepted eagerly once they understood the alternative." "What alternative?" Brother Mordecai's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Meaningless death, Father. Dying alone and forgotten, their knowledge lost forever. I give them immortality of a sort, their consciousness preserved, their skills available for the betterment of humanity. It's really quite generous when you think about it." But Anderson was thinking about the whispers he'd heard, the desperate pleas for release. "They're not grateful," he said. "They're suffering. They want to be free. Temporary discomfort," Brother Mordecai dismissed with a wave of his hand. "Once I perfect the resurrection process, they'll thank me for preserving them. They'll understand that their brief suffering served a greater purpose." Anderson looked at the bones again, seeing them now not as artifacts, but as people. Dr. Chen, who had tried to save brain tumor patients, Professor Williams, who had dedicated his life to preserving languages, 16 other individuals who had been reduced to supernatural prisoners by a madman's twisted vision of benevolence. "I won't let you continue," Anderson said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "I won't let you trap any more souls." Brother Mordecai raised the carving knife, its blade beginning to glow with the same sickly light as the bones. "You don't have a choice, Father. The ritual has already begun. By gathering the bones, by listening to their whispers, you've become part of the binding spell. Your soul is already half caught." Anderson felt it then, a tugging sensation, as if invisible hooks were trying to pull his consciousness out of his body. The carved symbols on the bones were reaching for him, trying to drag his spirit into their supernatural prison. But as the binding spell grew stronger, Anderson made a choice that surprised everyone in the cottage, including himself. Instead of fighting the pull, he embraced it. "If you want my soul," Anderson said, reaching toward the nearest bone, "you can have it, but I'm taking theirs with me." The moment his fingers touched the carved femur, Anderson felt his consciousness expand beyond his physical body. He was inside the bone, surrounded by Dr. Chen's trapped spirit, but he wasn't alone. His presence in the binding spell created a disruption, a crack in the supernatural prison that had held her for months. "Together," Anderson whispered to the trapped soul, "we break free together." Dr. Chen's spirit joined with his, their combined will focusing on the carved symbols that held them prisoner. The binding spell began to weaken, hairline cracks appearing in the bone's polished surface. Brother Mordecai screamed in rage, lunging forward with the carving knife, but it was too late. Anderson's sacrifice had created a chain reaction that was spreading to the other bones. Each trapped soul was finding strength in his example, adding their will to his until 17 spirits were working together to shatter their prisons. The bones began to crack, then crumble, then explode into clouds of glittering dust that filled the cottage with supernatural light. Each freed soul paused for a moment to thank Anderson before ascending toward whatever afterlife awaited them, their forms becoming points of light that passed through the cottage roof like shooting stars. Brother Mordecai aged rapidly as his collection was destroyed, centuries of unnatural life catching up with him in moments. His hair turned white, his skin became parchment thin, his filed teeth crumbled to dust. "You don't understand," he gasped as his body began to fail. "Without the binding spells, without the preserved knowledge, humanity will never defeat death." "Maybe that's not our choice to make," Anderson replied, feeling his own life ebbing away as the last of the bones crumbled to dust. "Maybe death isn't meant to be defeated." Brother Mordecai collapsed, his 3-century life finally coming to an end. Anderson felt himself growing weaker too, his sacrifice having cost him more than just his soul. It had cost him his life. But as darkness closed in around him, he felt at peace for the first time in years. 17 souls were free, and no more would be trapped by Brother Mordecai's twisted vision of immortality. Sometimes, Anderson realized, the greatest victory was knowing when to let go. Now get ready, let's start story 12, and if you're already scared, I feel sorry for you because now you're going to die of fear. Father Kowalski should have known something was wrong with St. Vincent's Cathedral the moment he heard the organ playing at 3 a.m., its haunting melody drifting through the abandoned halls like the voice of something that had forgotten how to die. But it wasn't until he saw the organist, skeletal fingers dancing across keys that should have been silent for decades, that he understood the true horror of what he'd stumbled into. It was October 2002, and Kowalski had been assigned to oversee the historical restoration of the cathedral in Savannah, Georgia. The building had been empty since a fire in 1968 had gutted the interior, killing 17 people, including the church organist who had tried to save the instrument he'd spent his life perfecting. The city wanted to restore it as a historical landmark, But strange reports had kept contractors and historians away. The organ was the cathedral's crown jewel, a massive instrument built in 1847 by German craftsmen who had incorporated techniques passed down through generations of organ builders. Even after the fire, it remained inexplicably pristine, its wooden frame unmarked by flames, its pipes gleaming as if they'd been polished that morning, its keys responding to touch with perfect pitch and tone. Kowalski first heard it during his preliminary inspection of the building. He'd been examining the altar area when the sound began, not a hymn or any recognizable piece, but something that seemed to flow like water, notes blending together in patterns that were both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The music filled the empty cathedral with impossible resonance, as if the building itself was singing. Following the sound to its source, Kowalski found the organ loft empty except for the instrument itself. The bench was positioned perfectly before the sound to its source. Kowalski found the organ loft empty except for the instrument itself. The bench was positioned perfectly before the keys, and the music continued to pour forth despite the absence of any visible performer. As Kowalski watched in fascination and growing dread, the keys depressed on their own, creating melodies that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his soul. The music wasn't random. It had structure, purpose, emotional depth that suggested conscious composition. But there was something wrong with it, something that made Kowalski's teeth ache and his vision blur around the edges. The notes were perfect individually, but together they formed harmonies that shouldn't exist, mathematical impossibilities that hurt to hear. "Magnificent, isn't it?" said a voice from behind him. Kowalski spun around to find a tall, gaunt man in formal evening wear, standing at the top of the loft stairs. The man's clothes were from the 1960s, a black tuxedo with tails perfectly pressed despite being over 30 years old. His hair was slicked back with pomade that gleamed in the dim light filtering through the cathedral's stained glass windows. "I'm sorry," Kowalski said, his hand moving instinctively to his collar to identify himself as clergy. "I didn't realize anyone else was here. I'm Father Kowalski, and I'm overseeing the restoration project." The man smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect, like porcelain caps over something rotten underneath. "Augustus Blackwood," he said with a slight bow. "Cathedral organist since 1943, though I suppose my employment status has become somewhat irregular in recent years." Kowalski felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. According to the records he'd studied, Augustus Blackwood had died in the 1968 fire, overcome by smoke while trying to protect the organ from the flames. His body had been found at the instrument's bench, his hands still positioned on the keys, as if he'd been playing until the very moment of death. "You died in the fire," Kowalski said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "I've read the reports." "You were found playing," Blackwood interrupted, his smile widening. "Yes, that's quite accurate. I was performing my masterpiece when the fire started. 37 years of composition, 3 decades of musical innovation, all leading to that single perfect moment when I could finally share my life's work with the world." The organ continued to play behind them, the impossible harmonies growing more complex, more beautiful, more wrong. Kowalski could see the keys moving now, depressing under invisible fingers that matched the rhythm of Blackwood's gestures as he spoke. "What happened that night?" Kowalski asked, though he suspected the answer would be more horrifying than anything in the official reports. Blackwood's expression grew dreamy, nostalgic. "I had discovered something wonderful, Father. A way to infuse music with genuine spiritual power, to create sounds that could reach directly into human souls and reshape them according to my vision. The fire was merely an inconvenience, a minor setback in my greater work." The cathedral around them began to change as Blackwood spoke. The burned sections started to repair themselves, charred wood becoming polished oak, melted metal reforming into gleaming fixtures. But the restoration was wrong. creating a version of the cathedral that had never existed, darker, more ornate, with architectural details that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. "I've been perfecting my composition for 34 years, Blackwood continued, conducting the invisible orchestra that filled the cathedral with supernatural music. "Every night I practice, I refine, I improve. Soon it will be ready for its debut performance, a piece so beautiful, so spiritually powerful, that it will transform everyone who hears it." Kowalski realized with growing horror that Blackwood wasn't just a ghost playing phantom music. He was something far more dangerous, a spirit that had learned to manipulate reality through sound, to reshape the physical world according to his artistic vision. The cathedral around them wasn't being restored, it was being transformed into something that had never been built by human hands. "Transform them how?" Kowalski asked, backing toward the stairs that led down from the organ loft. Blackwood's eyes lit up with the fervor of a true believer sharing his gospel. "Into perfection, Father. Music is mathematics, and mathematics is the language God used to create the universe. If you can speak that language fluently enough, you can rewrite the fundamental structures of reality itself." The organ's music grew louder, more complex, and Kowalski could feel it affecting him physically. His heartbeat was beginning to synchronize with the rhythm, his breathing matching the rise and fall of the melodies. The music wasn't just entering his ears, it was rewriting his biology from the inside out. "The fire started during my first public performance," Blackwood continued, his hands moving in elegant conductor's gestures that caused the organ pipes to swell with impossible harmonies. "I had gathered the entire congregation to hear my masterpiece, to witness the moment when human music transcended its earthly limitations and became truly divine." Kowalski tried to move toward the stairs, but his legs wouldn't obey. The music had taken control of his nervous system, overriding his conscious will with mathematical precision. He could only stand and listen as Blackwood described that terrible night in 1968. "The congregation began to change as they listened," Blackwood said with obvious pride. "Their faces became more beautiful, more symmetrical, as the music corrected the random flaws of natural birth. Their voices joined mine in perfect harmony, singing notes they had never learned but somehow knew in their very souls." The phantom cathedral around them flickered, showing brief glimpses of that night. Kowalski could see the congregation as Blackwood described them, men, women, and children whose features were becoming unnaturally perfect, whose eyes held an eerie intelligence that hadn't been there before. They sang along with the organ, their voices creating harmonies that made the air itself shimmer like heat waves. But something went wrong. Kowalski managed to gasp through the music's influence. The fire started somehow. Blackwood's perfect composure cracked slightly, revealing frustration and rage beneath his artistic passion. "Sabotage," he spat. "Father Morrison, the priest who served here before you, couldn't appreciate what I was accomplishing. He set the fire deliberately, choosing to destroy my masterpiece rather than allow humanity to evolve beyond its current limitations." The music faltered for a moment, and in that brief silence, Kowalski could think clearly again. The official reports had mentioned Father Morrison's heroic attempts to evacuate the building, but they'd been vague about how the fire had started. Now he understood. The priest had recognized that Blackwood's music was doing something unnatural to his congregation and had chosen drastic action to stop it. 17 people died in that fire, Kowalski said. 17 innocent souls who came to worship God, not to be transformed by your musical experiments. They achieved perfection, Blackwood shrieked, his composure shattered completely. They transcended their human limitations and became something greater. Father Morrison murdered them just as they were being reborn into a higher form of existence. The organ exploded into a cacophony of sound that was no longer music but pure noise. Discordant, painful, designed to inflict suffering rather than beauty. The phantom cathedral around them began to crumble, revealing the truth beneath Blackwood's illusions. The building was still burned, still ruined, still haunted by the screams of people who had died in agony as supernatural music rewrote their biology in ways human flesh couldn't survive. Kowalski saw them now, the ghostly forms of the 17 victims, their bodies twisted into impossible shapes by music that had tried to perfect them beyond the limits of human anatomy. They moved through the ruined cathedral like broken marionettes, their voices adding to Blackwood's cacophony in a chorus of eternal suffering. They're still here, Kowalski realized with horror. You've kept them trapped here, forced to be part of your composition for 34 years. They're my choir, Blackwood declared, his form becoming less human as his rage grew. His fingers elongated into something resembling organ pipes, his voice taking on harmonics that no human throat could produce. My eternal ensemble, perfected beyond death, beyond the limitations of flesh and bone. The twisted spirits of the congregation reached toward Kowalski with pleading gestures, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams that begged for release from their supernatural prison. They had been transformed by Blackwood's music into something between human and instrument, conscious beings forced to sing notes of anguish and despair for eternity. I'll complete my masterpiece tonight, Blackwood announced, his pipe-like fingers moving toward the organ keys. With a priest as my soloist, my composition will finally be perfect. Your trained voice, combined with their eternal harmonies, will create music powerful enough to transform the entire world. The organ began to play again, but this time the music was different, darker, more demanding, designed specifically to capture and transform Kowalski's soul just as it had captured the congregation 34 years ago. Kowalski felt the music wrapping around his consciousness like chains made of sound, trying to pull his soul into the supernatural composition that had been playing for over 3 decades. His voice began to respond involuntarily, humming along with harmonies that his rational mind knew were mathematically impossible. But as the ghostly congregation pressed closer, their twisted forms reaching out in desperate supplication, Kowalski understood something that Blackwood had missed in his obsession with musical perfection. These weren't willing participants in an eternal concert. They were prisoners, souls trapped by a madman's artistic vision and forced to sing their own torment for eternity. Your music isn't divine, Kowalski said, fighting against the supernatural compulsion to join the chorus. It's torture. You've created a symphony of suffering, not transcendence. Blackwood's pipe-like fingers paused above the organ keys. You don't understand. Music is pure mathematics, and mathematics is the language of creation itself. I'm not torturing them. I'm refining them, perfecting them, making them into something greater than they ever could have been in life. Look at them. Kowalski gestured toward the twisted spirits that surrounded the organ. Really look at what you've done to them. For the first time in 34 years, Blackwood actually looked at his eternal choir. He saw Mary Patterson, whose attempts to scream had stretched her mouth into an impossible oval that never closed. He saw Thomas Chen, whose arms had elongated into tentacle-like appendages that beat time against his will. He saw Sarah Morrison, Father Morrison's own daughter, whose eyes had been replaced by miniature organ pipes that wept melody instead of tears. They're beautiful, Blackwood whispered, but for the first time, his voice carried a note of doubt. They're in agony, Kowalski corrected. Every note they sing is a scream for help, every harmony a plea for release. You haven't created divine music. You've created a torture chamber with perfect acoustics. The organ music began to falter as Blackwood's certainty cracked. The supernatural composition that had been playing continuously for over 3 decades started to develop discord, wrong notes that revealed the pain underlying every measure. No, Blackwood said, his form flickering between human and instrument. My composition is perfect. It has to be perfect. I've spent decades refining it, improving it, making it into something that could touch the face of God. But Kowalski could see the truth now, written in the anguished faces of the trapped congregation. God didn't want your music, Augustus. That's why Father Morrison stopped you. Not out of ignorance or fear, but because he recognized that true divinity doesn't require forced transformation. The ghostly congregation began to move closer to Blackwood, their twisted forms surrounding the organ bench. For the first time since his death, the organist seemed to actually see them, not as instruments in his grand composition, but as people he had known, loved ones he had destroyed in pursuit of his artistic vision. "Sarah," he whispered, reaching toward Father Morrison's daughter. "Little Sarah, I was trying to make you perfect." The girl's pipe eyes wept a melody so sorrowful that it shattered several of the organ's windows. When she tried to speak, her words came out as music, beautiful, terrible music that conveyed more pain than any scream ever could. "Help us," she sang, the notes cutting through Blackwood's delusions like knives. "Please, let us go." Kowalski saw his opportunity. "You can end this, Augustus. You can release them from your composition. You can choose mercy over perfection." Blackwood's hands hovered over the organ keys, trembling with indecision. "But my masterpiece, 37 years of work. If I stop playing, if I release them, my music will die with them." "Your music died the night you killed 17 people to create it," Kowalski said gently. "What you've been playing since then isn't music. It's the sound of souls in torment. True music comes from joy, from love, from the willing expression of human emotion. What you've created is the opposite of everything music should be." Tears began flowing down Blackwood's face, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since his death. "I only wanted to touch divinity," he whispered. "I only wanted to create something beautiful enough to reach heaven." "Then let them go," Kowalski urged. "Show them the mercy you never received. Transform your masterpiece from a prison into a farewell." Blackwood looked around at the faces of his eternal choir, really seeing their suffering for the first time. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hands on the organ keys one final time. But instead of the discordant, supernatural composition he'd been playing for decades, he began something new, a simple hymn, "Amazing Grace," played with such genuine emotion that it seemed to heal the air around it. One by one, the twisted forms of the congregation began to straighten, their supernatural deformities fading as the healing music washed over them. Their voices joined in harmony, not the forced perfection Blackwood had imposed, but the natural, imperfect beauty of human voices raised in gratitude and relief. As the last note faded, the 17 spirits ascended toward whatever peace awaited them, their forms becoming points of light that passed through the cathedral's ruined roof. Blackwood watched them go with tears of joy and regret streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered to Kowalski before he too began to fade, his form dissolving into wisps of smoke that curled upward like incense. The cathedral fell silent for the first time in 34 years, finally free of the music that had tormented it for so long. 12 terrifying confessions from men of God who encountered evil in its purest form. These weren't just ghost stories, friends. These were testimonies from priests who learned that faith alone isn't always enough to protect us from the darkness that lurks in consecrated ground. If these stories of supernatural terror have followed you into your thoughts tonight, if you're looking over your shoulder wondering what shadows might be moving in the corner of your room, then do me a favor. Subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications, because this is just the beginning. There are more confessions waiting to be told, more priests who've encountered things that defy explanation, more stories that the church would prefer to keep buried in dusty archives. And if you want to support the channel and help me bring you more of these terrifying true experiences, consider sending a super thanks. Your contribution doesn't just keep the lights on, it helps me track down the most disturbing accounts from clergy members who've witnessed things that would shake your faith to its very core. Every super thanks supports the search for more true horror stories that were never meant to leave the confessional booth. Sweet dreams. And remember, some sins follow you beyond the grave.